Chapter 101 Whirlpool of Four Streams. Percy dropped the marble in the jar with the others, before pausing for a second to catch his breath. Then, he pushed the soul mana he'd just recovered through the ethereal cord, sending it to his wasp clone to do whatever he wanted with it. As for the pure mana, he gathered some between his palms, forming another sphere in preparation for the next crystal. Just one more before cleansing time. This was his routine now. Percy started his days by drinking 2 doses of Aurora, do 1 for each core, before spending all morning condensing crystals. He could even keep synchronization active for about half the time already. 20 minutes later, Percy added another marble to the pile, before deactivating circulation, relieving his body of the excess mana. Sealing the jar, he carefully placed it inside a leather pouch along with the rest of his alchemy tools. Only then did he dare open the curtain. Finally! Sunlight. Opening the window too, he stood in front of it for a minute, inhaling as much fresh air as he could, basking in the warmth. If it was up to him, he'd stay there longer. Unfortunately, he had other things to do. For one, it was already a couple hours past noon, and he was positively famished. Walking to the kitchen, he scanned the interior of his preservation box, ultimately settling on an apple. He was about to close it, though he hesitated. In the end, he grabbed a banana too. After devouring his snacks quickly, every second mattered. He begrudgingly closed the window and curtain again, picking 2 more vials of Aurora Dew from a cupboard. It was time for the second set of elixirs already. Man, why does everything I do have to involve some big secret? Perhaps it was ungrateful of him to complain. Most people would kill for the opportunities afforded to him by his bloodline. All things considered, shutting himself inside a room for part of the day sounded like a small price to pay. In the end, he shrugged, before biting both corks at once. Spitting them out, he drank the elixirs one after the other. Now for the tricky part. Pulling mana from both cores, he split each stream into 2, before sending them to his stomach. The ones made of pure mana passed horizontally by the front and back regions. They flowed in opposite directions, causing the contents of his stomach to churn, forming a miniature whirlpool inside his belly. As for the other 2 streams, the ones made of soul mana, they flowed along the left and right sides of his stomach. They merely phased through without causing any physical changes. However, the brief contact was enough to blend with the augmented beast mana released by the Aurora Dew. Finally, all 4 streams ended back at their respective cores, purifying both organs simultaneously. Let's aim for 90% this time. Naturally, Percy wasn't the one who'd invented this technique. The Moirai books had mentioned more than just the affinity fusion. After all, they contained the distilled knowledge of an entire culture of people who'd spent eons learning to live with 2 cores. Suffice to say, they'd had plenty of time to come up with a couple nifty tricks. This one was called the Whirlpool of 2 Streams. A little on the nose, but I suppose it did suffer 2 rounds of translation. As its name implied, it allowed one to purify both cores simultaneously, saving time. It worked by using 2 opposing flows of mana, one from each core, which then induced a rotation inside the stomach, spreading the beast mana uniformly. It sounded simple, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Core purification was a delicate process, and there was a reason mages carefully measured how much elixir they consumed per day. Going over that, they risked damaging their cores more than they should, while using less meant slowing down their advancement speed. What made this technique so profound was that it allowed the user to play around with the intensity of the flows, controlling how much beast mana reached each core. From there, it was all about manually balancing the 2 so they got cleansed at the same rate. If only I could use the technique in its original form, I would have mastered it already. Sadly, Percy's affinity had forced him to modify it. The soul mana was incorporeal, rendering it unable to physically affect the contents of his stomach. That meant he needed 2 streams of pure mana to properly form the whirlpool. Consequently, he had to split the soul mana too, otherwise his pure core would end up drawing more beast mana. Oh well, I guess Whirlpool of 4 Streams sounds catchier anyway. I'll patent it if I ever end up on the Moirai's world. Then again, they must have had plenty of people with the soul affinity in the past. Percy was probably just reinventing the wheel. In any case, the elixir was soon exhausted. Examining his cores, Percy realized he was off by a little again. His soul core burned slightly more than it was supposed to, which meant he'd have to skip the next purification session. As for the one in his abdomen, it had only benefited from around 85% of the substance. Percy clicked his tongue. Ever since he began practicing the technique, he'd experienced quite a few losses. Every wasted drop of Aurora Dew was like a dagger in his heart, especially since he knew exactly how valuable it was. And judging by the rate at which he improved, it would be a few more weeks until he perfected the art. But it can't be helped. It'll pay dividends in the long term. Though he'd mastered cleansing his cores while doing other things, it was no longer enough. After all, he now had to drink 6 doses per day, which added up to about 3 hours if taken separately. Granted, he could do it while brewing, but the distraction affected his yield. Consequently, learning to cut the time in half was a no-brainer. Besides, my next promotion should be like 15 years away. Losing a few weeks isn't the end of the world. Shaking his head, he opened a different cupboard, grabbing a few dozen vials filled with the regular elixir. Stuffing them in his satchel, he slung it over his shoulder before hurrying out. Percy still had some more crystals to condense in the evening, but he'd arranged for his brewing sessions to go in between. That way, he'd be able to recover his stamina, allowing him to use synchronization again later. In any case, his walk to Orin's place was the perfect opportunity to take in some more fresh air and to catch up with his clone. What's the situation there? Any closer to the nest? The clone had spent some time exploring the spire, though he'd never managed to delve too deep before getting kicked out by the queen. While Percy had thought it was worth mapping out the interior of the structure at first, he was beginning to reevaluate the usefulness of the clone. Nope, just more of the same. I think there's no point keeping me around. Percy nodded. They'd already discussed this. Next time he was on a break, he'd work with the clone on drawing a map of the outer layers of the colony. Not that it would be particularly helpful, but it felt like a waste to not even document his progress. After that, they'd destroy the wasp and resume sending regular clones for a while. I'll try again with a stronger bug at some point. Naturally, he hadn't given up on the project entirely, but it was proving even more challenging than expected. A starry soldier might move faster and withstand more mental pressure from the queen. He didn't know if it would be enough to reach the nest, but there should be an improvement. Reaching Orin's lab, Percy set his plans aside, clearing his mind of anything unrelated to alchemy. Over the rest of the afternoon, he processed the most recent batch of crystals into Aurora Dew, before bidding his mentor farewell. I need to be back home in about 20 minutes. He only met up with Nesha once a week to hand her the merchandise, but today happened to be the day. In any case, he had enough time to stop by Freddy's. Only after he was done getting his daily fix of socialization did he return to his place. There, he found Nesha standing outside, a grimace marring her face. You realize every minute I spend here, people might figure we're up to something, right? Percy rolled his eyes before letting her inside. It's not my fault. You're early, he replied in a nonchalant tone, keeping up the appearance of the aloof badass that he was. At least until Nesha's next words caused him to deflate. You've got honey on your cheeks. The girl left as soon as he handed her the elixirs, letting him return to his routine. He started by drinking another dose of Aurora Dew for his second core, before activating synchronization. Only then did he resume condensing crystals, keeping at it until around midnight. At that point, he decided to call it a day, taking a quick shower before going to bed. He'd be lying if he said he wasn't tired. Working for 18 hours a day was brutal, but he always focused on the next milestone to keep himself going. Right now, that was Mickey's second core. And it's getting close. I wonder what affinity he'll get. Chapter 102, Mickey's second core. A bit overkill, don't you think? I'll forget everything after I leave anyway. The oblivious agent said upon noticing Percy's disguise. I'd rather not take any chances, the latter replied, regurgitating his side of the conversation word for word. Fair enough. The man nodded once he drew closer. Then he carefully dropped the pouch on the ground like all their previous meetings. "Why do you guys even do this?" Percy asked again. "I can't speak for the others, but I'm just using my ability for the sake of my family." 3 out of 3 so far, Percy thought. By now, he'd met the man about a dozen times. He'd always repeated the exact same words to the agent, gauging his responses. While there were some minor permutations, the gist of what the guy said was more or less the same. At the very least, he'd never given him any reason to suspect he remembered any of their previous conversations. "Well, sure. But isn't the cost too high? Aren't you worried you'll look back one day, only to realize you can't remember half your life?" Percy asked the final set of questions, carefully observing the agent's reaction. "No offense, but forgetting you isn't that big a deal." The agent shrugged. "None taken." Percy nodded, relaxing. Either the agent had truly erased his memories as he was supposed to, or he was the best actor ever. In any case, this was the most Percy could do to contribute to the operation's security. "Let's leave this stuff to Nesha. She's better at it than I am." After watching the man leave, he called his familiar over, hoping this latest batch of enlightenment potions would seal the deal. By now, he'd already fed Mickey over 110,000 of the darn things which, according to his original estimates, should have been enough. Clearly, he'd miscalculated how much mind mana each dose contained, though he didn't know by how much. Best case scenario, today's shipment will be the last. As for the worst case scenario, I'd rather not think about it. Of course, even if they were still months away, he'd have no choice but to keep going. It wasn't like he had an alternative. "CW." The crow greeted him upon reaching his location. Percy didn't miss the hint of annoyance in its tone. While he'd explained many times how everything was for Mickey's benefit, the latter really hated gulping down potions for hours on end. "Just shut up and drink them." He rolled his eyes. Why was the crow even complaining? He was the one who'd spent weeks brewing elixirs so they could afford the potions anyway. "CRA?" The bird groaned but ultimately obeyed, flying to its nest. Over the next few hours, Percy remained on the ground level of the spire, practicing his affinity fusion while waiting for the familiar to finish. As for his wasp clone, he'd already retired him a couple months ago. Right now, he had another one active somewhere in the cosmos, though he doubted he'd accomplish anything of note. His successful expeditions so far could be counted on one hand. "I should go for the Starry Soldier next." He'd placed the infiltration mission on hold for the time being, to focus on more pressing matters, like mastering synchronization and affinity fusion. But he'd already grown much better at both. Also, his time in the guild wasn't infinite. While the lotus was still over 2 years from blooming, Percy couldn't afford to waste a second if he wanted to have the wasp familiar ready before leaving. "Caw!" Suddenly, Mickey called out to him. For a moment, Percy thought the bird had finished the potions, but it was too early for that. "Don't tell me?" he asked with hope in his eyes. "CW," the crow affirmed. Not missing a beat, Percy activated synchronization, rushing to his familiar at top speed. The bird's nest was a few miles away, but the young man crossed the distance in under a minute, stamina be damned. It was only when he got there that he remembered he could check Mickey's status from afar. Right? Mictlantecuhtli, Percival's familiar. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Orange. Beast. Mana core 2. Red. Ew. Spells.
Circulation refined.
Decrees. Morai's decree grants a second mana core. As usual, the bird lacked most of his decrees. Percy was particularly relieved it didn't have Metatrons either. He didn't know if Mickey could enter his portal should he ever open one, but he was certainly glad the crow couldn't create its own by accident. "It makes sense, since I only got it later." Beyond that, everything was as expected. Not to say he wasn't over the moon seeing Mickey's second core finally repaired. They'd worked on it for years. "Congratulations! This is huge." "CW." The bird seemed to share his enthusiasm, though not for the same reason. It was just glad it could finally stop drinking all those potions. Over the next couple of hours, Percy showed his familiar the ropes, explaining how it was meant to locate the new core and start clearing the corresponding channels. It helped he'd personally experienced the process twice already, as he had plenty of related memories to send over, getting the message across. I guess there's no point staying here. As impatient as he was, he knew the crow wouldn't be done for a few days at the earliest. Begrudgingly, he left the hunting grounds, though not before emphasizing to the bird that it should contact him the moment anything happened. It's going to be another beast affinity, isn't it? Percy knew there was a high chance of that happening. After all, he'd never heard of a beast possessing anything else. Then again, he'd never heard of one with two cores either. This would probably be an anomaly even on the Morais world. Though getting another beast affinity wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. It was responsible for the mutations and enhanced physical strength of its owners. With a second one of those, Mickey would probably grow even larger. In fact, Percy couldn't think of any other affinity that would synergize better with the crow's first one. He won't even have too many new channels to open, just a couple linking the second core to the rest of the circulatory system. That would be convenient at first, though it would come with its own share of downsides. For example, the crow wouldn't be able to get as much juice out of circulation with only one set of channels across both cores. Will a different affinity even help much though? Mickey had devoured thousands of wasp cores over the years. Percy wasn't sure how close the bird was to advancing again, but it shouldn't be far. As soon as that happened, he'd have a 2-grade gap between its cores. Even worse, the second one might never catch up, even with Aurora Dew. In the end, he shook his head. I'm just torturing myself. Whatever it is, we'll find a way to make it work. Well, as long as it wasn't another pure affinity. Now, that would suck big time. It wasn't until 3 days later that Mickey informed him he managed to draw some mana into his abdomen, activating the core. Only then did the bird finally come to appreciate the value of those potions, basking in its new strength. On the other hand, Percy couldn't help but frown. The affinity was still listed as a bunch of question marks. At the very least, it meant Mickey hadn't gained another beast affinity, as he would have recognized it. Just pull some mana from your core and send me the image. The bird followed his instructions, soon showing him a burst of mana emanating from the underside of its wing, brushing over the dark feathers. Carried a faint green tint. Not pure mana, was Percy's first reaction. In fact, he recognized it the very next moment, having personally used this particular affinity the most outside his own. It's air, he informed his familiar before elaborating. Remember that bandit you fought a few years back? He had that. Mickey remained silent for a few seconds, apparently recalling their journey to the guild. Eventually, he excitedly sent a mental nod back. Either way, this was great news. Besides a second beast affinity, this was essentially the best they could have hoped for. Though it would likely end up falling behind the crow's first core, it would support the bird well, allowing it to augment its flight. I can share my own experiences to get him started. He couldn't help but grin at the thought. The irony of a human teaching a bird how to fly faster wasn't lost on him. Still, there was no reason to waste all that training he'd undergone in the vault. Finally, we can stop spending all those contribution points on potions. I can start stockpiling ingredients for when we leave the settlement. Whether or not he succeeded in creating the wasp familiar, Percy hoped to amass enough resources by the time they left to last him for a while. Hopefully even for a decade or two. Admittedly, that was an ambitious goal but not impossible, assuming he could maintain his current income for the following 2 years. Unfortunately, he couldn't have predicted what would happen just 3 short months later. Chapter 103 House Talos. Lord Braun, the bastards have taken over the iron mine, the boy reported. The former's features twisted into a grimace. While a powerful mage could tear a sheet of iron apart as easily as paper, it was still a valuable resource across Remir. After all, most people were at the lower grades. They relied on everyday tools made of the mundane metal. Consequently, House Talos regularly exported it, making the mine an important economic asset for their family. What about the casualties? 16 dead, over 30 injured. Bronn wanted to clench his fists, yet he had enough awareness to hold back. Even the tough gemstone vials would shatter into powder in a violet's grip. It would be a shame to spill their contents. The elixirs had cost him an arm and a leg. Forcing himself to calm down, he spoke again. Who? Most of the dead were Redborns. Only 4 were Orangeborns. Though one of them was Uncle Zin. Bronn sighed. Could have been worse. At least they hadn't lost any Yellowborns. Still, Zin had been at Blue, making him one of the family's strongest fighters, regardless of what grade he'd started with. It was a significant loss. Bronn's only consolation was they hadn't been that close. The man had only been a distant nephew of his. Do we know who's stationed there? The boy scratched his head for a few moments. Only a couple of our people made it back, so we aren't too clear on the details. All we know is they have at least 2 blues. Rellon is among them. Bronn's eyes widened. Rellon was a Yellowborn and one of House Antia's strongest mages. Perhaps the 3rd or 4th from the top. Are you certain? The boy nodded before clarifying. There's no mistake. We spotted him from afar after he used his ability. Houses Talos and Antias actually had the same bloodline gigantification. This was a common occurrence on Remir, as neighboring families often shared ancestors. Rogue mages frequently left their homes for various reasons, establishing rival branches nearby. In any case, gigantification allowed a person to increase their size based on their grade. At Red, one could only double their height, while a blue core like Rellon could grow 6 times as tall. People jokingly referred to it as a poor man's beast affinity, though the transformation wasn't nearly as drastic. Tell Lauren, Seaton and Hurt to pick 10 greens and go drive those assholes away. But Lord Bronn, what if it's a trap? The boy protested. Bronn shook his head. It isn't. They never intended to keep the mine. It's much closer to our estate. They know they can't hold it. They just wanted to hurt us. The boy bobbed his head in understanding before bolting out. However, the door didn't get the chance to close before another person ran into the office. What is it now, Floria? Bronn asked in exasperation. The girl bent over, holding her knees as she caught her breath. Grandpa. They've attacked Oakbridge Town. They took the guards out and razed the warehouse down. Bronn couldn't stop himself this time. Slamming his free fist on the desk, he crushed it into a rain of splinters. It was lucky Floria was at Green, or he could have hurt her. Are they still there? Oakbridge Town was one of 3 under their jurisdiction. Unlike House Talos Estate where the members of their family lived, the towns in their control were full of commoners. This was another relatively widespread convention on Remir. Still, these towns were far from worthless. They constituted important trading hubs for the noble houses. Even more notably, the nobles often married Yellowborn commoners, bringing new blood into the fold, enhancing their strength. Flinching at her grandfather's outburst, the girl took a moment before answering.
No.
They left as soon as they were done, she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. Bronn rubbed his eyelids. Damn it! Why couldn't they wait just a few more years? Truth be told, he had expected their enemies to escalate at some point. While House Antias currently had the upper hand, both sides knew this wouldn't last forever. Bronn's son was getting closer to Violet. As soon as he advanced, the tides would change. Of course, a single Violet core couldn't take on an entire family by themselves, but their strength still couldn't be ignored. On paper, a Violet core was about 3 times as strong as a blue. However, conventional wisdom was that it would usually take about 5 blues to pin one down. That's because they'd fight less efficiently, some of their strength wasted due to bad teamwork. Then there was the entire morale aspect of having another powerful leader at the head of an army. Overall, getting a second Violet core would be a huge deterrent. It might even let House Talos go on the offense. Call Foon over. Floria scurried away, probably glad to be out of her grandpa's sight right now. A few minutes later, a man walked into the office. He threw the broken desk a passing glance before chuckling. Dad, you have to stop smashing desks. We can't keep up with you. Bronn almost snapped at him, but he caught himself. Instead, he plopped down on his chair, At least this piece of furniture was still standing, before tilting his head up at the ceiling. Then he laughed bitterly. This is the 5th attack in the last 2 months. We've already lost about 10% of our men. Foon stopped smiling. The bastards must really want to build up their advantage before my promotion. Bron nodded. At this rate, they'll succeed. How close are you? But Foon shook his head. Dad, you know this is my 3rd promotion already. It was true. Foon had been cleansing his core for centuries. It wasn't easy to calculate the exact date it would bear fruit. Give me your best estimate. Foon appeared to ponder his words for a while. Well, before you brought me these new elixirs, I would have said maybe between 8 and 15 years. And it had already been around 9 months since he'd started taking this so-called Aurora Dew. It meant he was anywhere between 2 and 4 years away now. So close. For blue and violet cores like them, 4 years were nothing. If only those assholes had waited just a little longer, they could have caught them by surprise and wiped their stench off the region. But alas, we can't wait that long. At this rate, they'll burn everything to the ground by then. They can't eliminate us completely. As soon as I advance, we'll turn everything around. Foon protested. Yet Bron disagreed. I'm sorry, son. We can't afford to do that. We might win in the end, but half our family will be ruined by then. Hey, you're the boss. It's your decision. Foon shrugged, before adding. But I'm confused. What's the alternative? What else? We flipped the table. The 2 men looked down at the broken pieces of wood as Bron scratched his head. Figuratively speaking. Then he crouched by the remains of his desk, digging through the pile. A few seconds later, he found what he was looking for inside a somewhat intact drawer. It was a bottle of ink. You mean? Foon asked, realization flashing in his eyes. Bron nodded. He handed his son the elixirs, before walking to a cupboard. There he found a quill and a piece of paper. Dipping the quill in the ink, he held the paper against the wall as he began writing. We'll reach out to the Divine Order. Ask them to get those bastards off our backs. Foon didn't say anything. He stood by silently, watching Bron compile the letter. What the latter had left unsaid was that the Divine Order wouldn't interfere in a conflict between 2 houses just because one of them asked nicely. They'd only do so if they gave them a good reason to. About half an hour later, Bron reread everything, nodding in satisfaction. Folding the letter, he slid it into an envelope, before digging through his desk's remains again, this time for his seal. Then, he extended his hand towards Foon, holding out a red candle. The latter heated it up with his fire mana, before Bron splotched a blob of wax on the envelope, stamping it down with the seal. Only then did he hand it to his son.
I'm sorry, Foon.
I suppose you'll have to reach Violet with the regular elixirs like everyone else. 2 years, 13 years. It's not that big a difference. Foon shrugged, before assuming a more serious tone. But, are you sure about this? It's the only way. Bron smiled bitterly. Take the letter and the elixirs to the Divine Root. Father and son looked each other in the eyes, knowing they were about to turn Remier upside down. Chapter 104, Smooth Sailing No More. Percy was on the way back from Orin's place, when he saw an unusual group of people heading towards him. What's going on? He raised an eyebrow, stopping in his tracks. None of them wore the guild's robes. They were outsiders. Of course, that alone wouldn't have shocked him. Lots of merchants passed by every day. What left him speechless was that he recognized the insignia on their clothes. It definitely wasn't one he often saw on the streets. Depicting a series of roots emerging from the underside of a cloud, there was no mistaking it. These were members of the Divine Root. Shit! What do they want from me? Is our jig up? Even among the 7 great houses, the Divine Root was a special existence, as they were closely affiliated with the Divine Order. The inner circle of the Divine Order consisted only of gods, or of the mortals deemed talented enough to have a chance of ascending to divinity one day. Their job was to look outwards, guarding Remier against external threats. While they were the undisputed leaders of Remier, They didn't have the time to manage all the worldly affairs beneath their feet. Consequently, the deities delegated many of those tedious tasks to their subordinates. The divine root was essentially their outer circle, consisting solely of mortals who lacked the potential to attain godhood. Not that it made them weak. While the gods viewed the members of the divine root as talentless rejects, the failed children who weren't good enough to join them, the rest of Remir could only look up to them, as they stood at the top even among the rest of the great houses. After all, many were direct descendants of the deities themselves, making the organization the largest gathering of blessings and powerful bloodlines in the world. They're like the people of the vault, all gathered in a single house. Percy clenched his fists, knowing there was no escaping. There was a blue core in the group. He was a tall man with gunmetal gray hair whose piercing gaze sent shivers down his spine. Though this person was the same grade as Orin, the two couldn't be further apart in strength. I bet he has a blessing. He might even be able to hold his own against Baldy for a minute or two. As the men approached, 6 of them in total, Percy couldn't help but instinctively hold his breath. The suffocating auras they passively radiated making it difficult to do otherwise. And when they were only a couple meters away, he closed his eyes too, bracing for the worst. Huh? They just ignored me. The group passed right by him, most of them not sparing him a glance. The only exception was a blond young man who appeared the same age as him. He was already at green, probably a yellow-born. He scanned Percy for the briefest of instants, his derisive sneer soon giving way to cold indifference. Only once they were all behind him did Percy remember to let out the turbid air in his lungs, cold sweat trickling down his face. Right? We've gone to great lengths to hide our trail. It's probably just a coincide. Sadly, he didn't even get to the end of that thought before the world proved him wrong. A shockwave suddenly coursed through him, making everything around him shake. It was followed by a gust of wind that sent the colorful particles of mana southward. The bizarre event felt extremely familiar, the last time something like this happened being firmly engraved in Percy's memory. Attention, denizens of Remir. This is Hermes again. The eccentric god's voice boomed from everywhere at once. It's quite rare for me to be making announcements like this so often. So, hooray for you, I guess. You get to hear a god speak twice in a few years. What's more, it's good news again. So double hooray. Trust me, it's better than the alternative. You really don't want me to come out here informing you that Remir has fallen and you're all about to die. The god chuckled. Relax, that was a joke. Well, not really. Could actually happen. I just found it funny. In any case, you might be wondering why I'm contacting you again. No, the lotus hasn't bloomed early. That's still over 2 years away, as originally planned. Today, I'm reaching out for a different matter. Percy swallowed hard, holding some hope deep down that it wasn't about him. Though it was evaporating quickly, it would be way too big of a coincidence. And sure enough, you see, one of the brilliant folks in the Alchemist's Guild has invented some new elixirs that can be consumed 3 times as often. I trust one don't have to explain what this means for Remir. Gee, thanks for the compliment. Percy smiled bitterly as his worst fears came to light. Speaking as somebody who's seen lots of amazing treasures out there, each of which would make your mouths water. This is huge, even for us. We'll get more gods, and you'll get more violet and white cores. The only ones who'll get squat are the Redborns. But then again, who cares about them anyway, right? It's not like we had enough elixirs to waste on them before, let alone now. However, everyone else will benefit. Well, as soon as we can mass-produce this so-called Aurora Dew, that is. Big fan of the name, by the way. Props to whomever came up with it. In any case, this is all nice and dandy, but we've sadly run into a small problem. Knowing where this was heading, Percy took off, hurrying towards Nesha's gambling den. Contacting her right now was risky, but so was waiting around until the divine root homed in on them. Apparently, the smartass who came up with the recipe chose to keep it to himself, sneaking around to sell it to a small number of people at a premium. Honestly, I get the temptation, but we can't have that. Whoever you are, we're willing to pretend the last few months never happened. provided you come forward right now. We'll give you something for your trouble, and a nice God-approved pat on the back, and we can all have a great time moving forward. We know you've gone through a lot of trouble to hide from us, but trust me, that isn't going to last long. We've already sent a group from the Divine Root to interrogate all the registered alchemists in the guild, and they'll find you sooner or later. Until then, security at the guild's borders will be tripled, and nobody will be allowed to enter or exit without being searched from head to toe. I suppose I needn't say anything else. If you were smart enough to come up with such a marvelous elixir, you can probably tell what's best for you. The rest, I'll leave to our capable underlings. Bobby. Crap. Percy couldn't help but curse in his head. This was about as bad as expected. The only upside was that he'd never taken the test to officially register as an alchemist. That was probably why the men had ignored him earlier. Well, that and the fact he was dressed in orange robes. Nobody would have expected him, of all people, to be behind such a breakthrough. But his cheap veil of anonymity wouldn't last forever. As soon as the Divine Root ran out of people to search, they'd branch outwards, until they eventually got to him or Nesha. Even if they destroyed all the evidence of the operation by then, Percy still had plenty of other secrets he couldn't afford to leak. If anyone wondered why he had a bandage wrapped around his abdomen, it could easily lead to them learning about his second core. From there, the gods would get involved directly, discovering Metatron's decree too. Realizing how quickly he was running out of time, Percy quickened his steps. And that's assuming Orin doesn't tell them anything. He knew his mentor wouldn't hurt him on purpose, but the man had been opposed to keeping the secret from the beginning. If the old alchemist thought he was doing Remier, or even Percy, a favor, he might choose to come forward. Reaching Nesha's place, he forced himself to calm down, trying not to look too suspicious. Entering the building, his ears soon buzzed with a cacophony of cheers and loud discussions. The den was packed to the brim with Nesha's regulars, but none of them was playing right now. They'd all forgotten about the chips, dice, and cards in their hands, instead excitedly talking about the announcement they just heard. Can you believe it? I'm only 70 years old. I can actually reach Violet and become the leader of my house one day, somebody shouted. But his mate slapped him on the back. Yeah, right. The Yellowborns will get the elixirs too. Remember? By the time you get to Violet, Remier will be unrecognizable. There might be dozens of whites and thousands of violets by then. I doubt the number of noble houses will increase that much though. It'll only raise the bar higher. The first guy appeared to ponder his friend's words, but somebody else spoke next. Screw politics. With this, we'll live much longer. Though the new guy got shot down fast too. You idiot. Most people don't die of old age anyway. When's the last time you met somebody older than 600? We'll still get killed in some war like before. More shouts ensued, but Percy ignored them, pushing forward. Luckily, nobody seemed to pay him any attention either. Eventually, he reached Nesha. At first, neither of them said anything, as they merely exchanged a knowing glance. Only a few seconds later did she speak. 2 hours. Percy nodded, before turning around and leaving. They'd already made plans for the worst-case scenario. After all, they'd always intended to stop the operation within a couple of years anyway. Naturally, their clients wouldn't have taken kindly to the supply of Aurora Dew getting cut off abruptly. So Percy and Nesha had prepared an exit strategy. Of course, they'd originally planned to be long gone by the time the shitstorm reached the settlement. Sadly, it was too late for that now, complicating things. That said, I'll be damned if I give away all my hard work to those assholes. Chapter 105. Escape. She's taking forever. Percy tapped his foot. Standing at the base of the fungal spire, he was waiting for Nesha to arrive. The 2 hours she'd mentioned were nothing more than the time until she closed the gambling den for the night. Despite the urgency of the situation, she couldn't just drop everything and run away abruptly, as that would raise more than a couple eyebrows. At least the guards didn't search me on the way here. Evidently, the Divine Root had only bothered to increase the security at the gate leading outside the guild, and presumably the spire's perimeter. Even in normal times, they mostly cared about people leaving the settlement, to ensure they weren't carrying any nectar with them. breaking the guild's monopoly on the substance. It was why Percy hadn't been checked thoroughly upon first arriving. Also, why the agent hadn't encountered too much trouble smuggling the Aurora Dew or the Enlightenment potions over the past few months. As for the people hunting on the mushrooms, nobody ever bothered to track their movements. Noticing something by the corner of his eye, Percy turned to see his familiar swiftly approaching. "CW," the bird greeted upon landing. "Caw indeed," Percy replied, before sifting through the bandage wrapped around Mickey's abdomen. It was the same one he'd used back when he still met the agent regularly. Since he no longer had to do that, he'd long passed it to the crow to conceal its new core. Not that a beast adorned with an accessory wasn't conspicuous, but it was certainly better than the alternative. Especially since Percy had purposely commissioned for the bandage to be crafted out of a dark fabric, to more easily blend in with the bird's plumage. "Where is it?" Percy's heart skipped a beat after failing to find what he was looking for. "Don't tell me you dropped it?" "KRA. KRA?" The bird protested in indignation before pecking his shoulder. It was only a few seconds later that he finally located a small object somewhere between the cloth and the feathers, dousing his rising panic. Next, Percy wore it around his neck. It was a pendant with a weirdly shaped gem as its focus. Cut into a perfect cube, the lustrous stone somewhat resembled onyx, though that wasn't quite what it was. Countless tiny lights glittered like stars across its faces, contrasting against the ebony backdrop they dotted. Looking closer, the particles weren't splayed randomly, instead forming orderly constellations. Percy knew those were the runes responsible for the enchantment. It's pretty and useful, but still lackluster compared to what they have in the vault. "I admit rushing to buy the spatial amulet was the right move," Nesha said, having arrived at some point. He shrugged. "Well, we couldn't exactly carry everything around without it." After awakening the familiar second core, Percy hadn't really had much else he'd wanted to spend his money on. His only goal at that point had been to amass enough brewing materials to last him for some time. Of course, considering his and Mickey's rate of consumption, and his less-than-stellar yield, Percy currently needed around 20 doses of the regular elixirs per day, which translated to thousands over the course of a single year. Luckily, he'd made plenty of contribution points during the past 9 months. Over 8 million in total. Of those earnings, he'd spent more than 1 million on the Enlightenment potions and another 1 million on the amulet. As for the other tools and secondary materials he needed to brew on the run, well, those cost peanuts comparatively speaking. In any case, that had still left him over 6 million to buy the primary ingredients of the Aurora Dew, the regular elixirs. "I can't believe there are nearly 20,000 doses in this tiny necklace," he mused. Though 1 cubic meter of space wasn't that much, it could easily fit enough of the pinky-sized vials to last him for years. Nesha had also pitched in, converting her own share into materials, storing them in Percy's amulet. With these, they could both keep drinking Aurora Dew for the next 2 years. Of course, he'd originally planned to remain here longer. Sadly, that wasn't possible now. As things stood, they'd run out of elixirs right after the lotus bloomed. And depending on how their escape went, they might not be able to return to the guild for more. "Oh well, that's a problem for future Percy. Are you sure this is the best move?" Nesha suddenly asked, fidgeting. "For me, yes," Percy replied before elaborating. "Coming clean to the divine root is admittedly tempting, but I have other secrets besides the elixirs that I don't want them to learn." Nesha gave Mickey a cursory glance. "You mean this orange cord beast you've somehow tamed?" "Among other things," he replied vaguely. Even if he could somehow guard all his secrets from them, he wasn't entirely convinced they'd treat him as fairly as they claimed. After all, he'd seen the disdainful looks the people of the divine root had given him, and he'd heard the sheer contempt with which Hermes talked about Redborns. The moment they realized how easily the pure mana could be crystallized, he'd lose all worth in their eyes. "No, escaping is my only option. Not Nesha's, though." Glancing at her, he pondered the implications of what he was asking her to do. Depending on how everything went, they might end up as fugitives on the run from actual gods. "You don't have to come with me." Nesha raised an eyebrow. They're more likely to notice my involvement. I was the one in charge of everything. And unlike you, I won't be able to give them what they want. They'll skin me alive, she said, biting her lip. But Percy shook his head. My mentor knows the recipe. Find him and work together to make a deal with them. They only want the elixirs. They don't really care what happens to you. What Percy had left unsaid was that this way, he'd lose both his advantage and his means of making money. In a few years, he might be the only one on Remier who couldn't afford the Aurora Dew. Well, me and all the other Redborns. Still, it wouldn't be fair to force his problems on Nesha. The girl nervously crossed her arms, apparently considering it. At first, he gave her a couple of minutes to think. It was a huge decision, and he didn't want to rush her. However, as she continued to remain silent, he was about to urge her when she suddenly spoke. I'll come with you. Percy carefully scanned her. Nesha had stopped shaking, her eyes now burning with determination. He didn't mind her tagging along. He trusted her after working together for so long. Plus, she was useful not only because of her bloodline and commercial skills but also due to her affinity. Though there was one thing he needed to know first. Why? Nesha furrowed her brow, apparently contemplating the question. Before we started collaborating, I was working towards a certain goal, though I suppose I always knew deep down that it wasn't a very realistic one. She ultimately said. What changed? Percy asked. She shrugged. Well, I've made more money in the past year than I would have made in a decade. Not to mention, the elixirs gave me hope of catching up to my enemies in this lifetime. Lifetime? Percy failed to suppress a chuckle. If you come with me, I can't even promise we'll be alive tomorrow. Plus, the recipe is going public in 19 years regardless of what we do. She certainly knew he was telling the truth, though she didn't seem deterred. I have a hunch that sticking with you will give me a chance to get my revenge. That's enough. Percy grinned. Welcome to the team then. By the way, the bird is Mickey. She nodded. So, what's the plan? Are we going to look for a weak point in the perimeter? She asked. But Percy shook his head. Even on the off chance we get out, they'll spot us. It'll only be a matter of time before they let the people in charge know. And we can't outrun a blue corps. What other choice do we have? We can't leave through the front gate. Percy smiled. How about below the guild? Nesha tilted her head. She appeared about to voice her confusion when, crack, a loud noise came from a bunch of boulders a few dozen meters away from them. There seemed to be a hole in the rocky formation, though it was only big enough for something the size of an apple to squeeze through. The sounds escalated as the stones by the tiny entrance began to shake. A few moments later, a pair of oversized mandibles pierced through, followed by a head and a torso. Before long, a man-sized wasp emerged, widening the tunnel in its passing. Nesha took a step back, already drawing mana from her core, as a pitch-black bubble manifested in her hand. But she didn't stop there, gathering more as she stared at the bug. How the hell did a starry soldier end up on the first level? She asked nobody in particular. Percy placed his hand on her shoulder. Stop. The bug is our way out, he said, eliciting an odd expression from his friend. Nesha turned towards the wasp again, her features twisting in incredulity upon seeing the creature wave at her with its forelimb. Chapter 106. Unsettling. Percy removed his robes, carefully folding them before placing them on the ground. Man, I'm so going to miss the self-cleaning enchantment. Unfortunately, he couldn't risk being seen wearing his guild attire outside. Doing so would only needlessly increase the risk of people connecting him to the elixirs. The same went for his old clothes. He was better off masquerading as a commoner to avoid bringing his house trouble. That was why he'd brought 2 sets of plain, linen outfits, one for himself and one for Nesha. How do you even control these beasts? The wasp is a higher grade than you. Her voice rang out from the other side of the tree, where she was also changing. I'll explain if we survive. No point wasting my breath before then. He replied as he pulled up the boot on his right foot. Fair enough, she said, though she caught herself a moment later. Wait, What do you mean, if we survive? How confident are you in this plan? Percy shrugged, though she couldn't see him. But neither party spoke much over the next few minutes, as he waited for her to finish. At some point, he remembered the honey roll he'd bought in a hurry before rushing out of the settlement. Digging through his folded robes, he found the snack in one of the pockets, gleefully biting a chunk off. It had grown cold, but he wasn't deterred. It was debatable whether stopping by Freddy's had been wise given the circumstances, though Percy had wanted to chat with his pal one last time before leaving the guild for good. While he hadn't dared to bid the man farewell, afraid to get the poor guy involved in his mess, he knew that might have very well been his last chance to see him. And this could be my last honey roll ever. Slowing down to savor it, he looked up at the mushrooms above. They still showered the ground level with their wondrous particles. Percy would never forget the first time he saw them, on that fateful night some 3 years ago.
No.
I'll definitely come back one day. A couple minutes later, he and Nesha stood by the mouth of the tunnel his clone had dug up, gazing at the colorful glow emanating from within. Swirling motes of light danced in the air, reflecting off the tunnel's slick walls, casting a mesmerizing, almost dreamlike atmosphere around them. Despite its beauty, Percy keenly felt the weight of the danger lurking beneath them. "Let's get this over with," he silently conveyed to his clone. That was when the starry soldier approached, opening its jaws wide before suddenly spitting something at him. Percy barely closed his eyes in time to avoid the green goo splattering all over his face. This serving of sludge had nothing to do with the nectar in the bug's gland. Rather, it had come from its stomach. It was thick like mucus, sliding slowly down his neck. Its stench, a disorienting blend of musk and rot, hit him instantly. "Ugh!" he grunted, resisting the urge to gag as he used his hands to smear the creature's vomit all over his clothes. The insect continued to throw up more of the disgusting substance. Nesha retched, recoiling back in horror at the sight. Percy would have grinned if not for the fear of accidentally swallowing some of the foul goo. After another mouthful of vomit splashed onto him, he nodded in satisfaction, before waving a hand toward the bug, sending it after his partner. "Eek! Keep that thing away from me!" she shrieked, stepping back as the creature advanced, though the clone ignored her, closing in against her protests. "Let it do it if you want to survive," Percy said, wiping his mouth on the last clean patch of his shirt before explaining. "The interior of the spire is filled with wasps. This is the only way to keep them from attacking us. Hopefully." He kept that last part to himself. Nesha groaned, wrinkling her nose in disgust as she reluctantly began slathering the vomit on her clothes. Eventually, she broke the long silence as soon as she was done. "Isn't it forbidden to enter these tunnels?" "Sure," Percy admitted, "but we're already criminals. Or we will be if people find out what we've done. Also, nobody is going to know about this. They can't monitor all these openings. There are too many. Not that they need to, as entering is a death sentence in and of itself." "Lovely," she spat sarcastically. Then Percy turned to his familiar. Over the next few minutes, he had his clone cover the crow with the sludge too, taking the opportunity to strap their old clothes on the wasp's back. The idea was for it to dispose of them somewhere in the tunnels below, as soon as they escaped the guild. Before long, he was done, as was the bug. "Krah!" Mickey cawed in annoyance, trying to peck some of the goo out of his feathers. Percy had considered letting him fly away on his own, but they didn't know how tight the security was around the perimeter. "Oh well, for all we know, he won't survive if I die anyway. Are you ready?" he asked Nesha. Getting a nod back, he embraced the bird with his left elbow, before offering his right hand to his partner. She stared at it for a moment before reluctantly grabbing hold. "Whatever happens inside, don't let go." The two then walked into the vibrant cave, the starry soldier right behind them. As soon as they were all inside, the bug turned around and lunged at the walls of the tunnel, clawing at them with its thin forelegs, biting at them with its mandibles. "Now what?" Nesha asked as the cave's opening collapsed, sealing the way back. The tunnels on the first level aren't supposed to be large enough for people, Percy explained. As they delved deeper into the hive, the bug kept digging at the walls, collapsing everything in their wake. If anyone saw what Percy was doing to the interior of the spire, they'd have rushed to skin him alive. I prefer to think of it as restoring the environment to its original state, which was technically correct. The tunnels his clone was currently destroying were the very ones he'd personally widened over the past few weeks. Naturally, he couldn't have possibly built the entire tunnel leading outside. It would be too long for a single bug to pull off in such a short time. Even for one at Yellow, Percy's clone had merely expanded some sections, linking the ground level of the spire to the network a few dozen meters underground. Most of the tunnels the group would be using had already existed beforehand. It's a pity I couldn't get to the Queen's Nest though. Even though his latest clone had delved much deeper than the worker, he still hadn't managed to reach the eggs. It was one of the reasons Percy wanted to return to the guild in the future, to try again after possessing one of the green bugs. After all, the prospect of a starry wasp familiar was too tempting to give up on. Bzzzzzzzzzzzzz. Percy was taken out of his thoughts as the trio encountered the first few bugs. There were only 5 drones in front of them, but a quick scan via soul vision revealed twice as many lurking around the corner. Nesha's grip tightened, the girl appearing a little shaken. A few red beasts were nothing to a yellow core, but she didn't have much experience hunting, and the current circumstances were more than a little claustrophobic. Listen, the further we go, the more of them there will be. Higher grades too. Don't try fighting them or running away. If the goo fails us, we'll be overwhelmed anyway. At first, his words seemed counterproductive, only causing the color in her face to drain further. Still, Nesha bit her lip to calm down, before forcing a strained smile. Great. Let's hinge all our lives on bug vomit. Percy grinned too, mostly to suppress his own bubbling unease, as he pressed onward, bringing the others along. The drones paused upon noticing them, eyeing them curiously. From his clone's experience, Percy understood they were trying to discern whether they posed a threat to the colony. No wasp below Yellow would attack him unprovoked outside, but things here were different. Still, after approaching and giving them a cursory feel with its antennae, the bug turned away, seemingly satisfied with their credentials. Its pals returned to their jobs too, back to grazing the concentrated mana off the tunnel's walls. So far so good, he muttered, keeping his voice down. The others seemed to have grown a touch more confident too, as Nesha picked up the pace, probably eager to get the hell out of here before the scent wore off. Sadly, no amount of confidence could have prepared them for what followed. Chapter 107 Hell. Countless legs poked Percy from all sides, pushing him around like a boat amidst a sea of insects. They came in all sizes, from the rod-like limbs of the soldiers pinning him to the ground, bruising his body with each heavy step, to the stick-like legs of the drones crawling all over his skin. Their soft, frequent taps were as intrusive as they were unnerving. The young man had to lean on both knees and one elbow, desperately trying to resist the weight of the wasps above, doing his best to keep Mickey from getting squashed in his embrace. Ugh, hi! Percy couldn't help but groan in pain, as the frightened crow clenched its talons, digging into his flesh and soul both. As for his right hand, it didn't fare much better. Creaking as Nesha clasped it tightly, short-lived but frequent tremors coursing through his bones every few moments. It was nearly impossible to make out what was happening around them, as the flurry of insect shadows bled into the dizzying glow of the cavern, plunging Percy's surroundings into chaos. Still, he vaguely spotted his partner trying to shield her head with her free hand, her face a nauseated green. "Hold on," he shouted, though his voice barely pierced through the buzzing cacophony of the hive. At first, he wasn't sure Nesha heard him, but a prompt squeeze of her palm soon revealed she indeed had. Percy gathered all his strength to crawl forward, forcing himself against the current. Should I use circulation? Even with 2 orange cores and a trained body, enduring the current of bugs without his boosting art was a struggle. The thought of resorting to it was tempting, especially since the dense accumulation of mana inside the tunnel promised to make the act easier than ever. but he shook his head. Inducing such a conspicuous flow of ambient mana risked drawing the wrong type of attention from the insects. Gritting his teeth, he pushed through the river of wasps with brute strength alone, still protecting his familiar with one hand, guiding the girl forward with the other. Inch by inch, they made some progress, though it would take them days to reach the exit at this pace. Not to mention, the constant scratches caused by the bugs' limbs threatened to tear what little remained of their clothes off, and the soldiers go with it. Shit! If we lose the scent, we're done, he realized before calling out to his clone. Do something, will you? The latter had to deal with the rushing bugs too, but his hard exoskeleton ensured he had an easier time doing so. His body was built for precisely this environment after all. Heeding Percy's call, he dove forward, alleviating some of the pressure with his frame, finally allowing the trio to move a little faster. With the immediate danger warded off for the time being, the group, 2 humans, 1 bird and 1 wasp, crawled closer to one another, doing their best to not fall into the same predicament again. Of course, some of the insects still climbed over them, but there were fewer now, as the clone focused on clearing the path ahead. Yet, Percy swallowed hard as a soldier's stinger brushed right by his cheek, narrowly missing his eye. Had it landed a couple inches to the right, it would have skewered his brain, pumping his skull full of acid. At least it wasn't on purpose, he realized in relief. Not that he particularly cared about souring his relationship with a random bug, but had the creature intentionally attacked, it would have meant the rest of its kin were about to follow suit. The party continued like this for several hours, each of them visibly fighting both the exhaustion and to keep the contents of their stomachs from spilling. Percy handled the situation slightly better than his companions, but only because he'd already experienced this many times before, through his clone's memories. Even so, there was a stark difference between merely recalling his clone's second-hand experience, in its native environment no less, and actually enduring it with his real body. Less room for mistakes too. Eventually, the slope beneath their feet tilted upward, the density of bugs in the winding tunnel dropping about half an hour later. They were still some distance from their destination, but they appeared to have crossed the halfway mark. Suddenly, Percy stopped. Nesha flashed him a questioning look, but he ignored her, busy communicating with his clone instead. Soon, the bug turned around, spitting a new round of vomit on him. Understanding his intentions, the girl then closed her eyes, silently inviting the clone to renew her own cover too. She appeared to have finally overcome her disgust for the sludge. I suppose it would be strange if she still cared about that, he chuckled. Only after the whole group had undergone the process did they resume their journey. Honestly, Percy wasn't sure the substance was necessary anymore, as the entire hive reeked with the foul stench this far in. From what he understood, this was how the bugs communicated to one another who was a friend. It doesn't hurt to be careful, he shrugged. In any case, the party of 4 continued their trek through the colorful tunnel, finally able to appreciate the scenery now that the flood of bugs had grown less chaotic. Percy had seen the lustrous deposits decorating the walls before, though they looked twice as beautiful now that he sported a better pair of eyes. Nesha gawked at the sight too, seemingly having set her fears aside. Percy didn't blame her for it either. The view was truly mesmerizing, especially for someone stumbling upon it for the first time. A couple hours later, the traffic of bugs nearly disappeared entirely, as the group approached the artificial part of the hive the clone had personally dug up. At last, the most dangerous part of the trip was already behind them, or so they thought. Suddenly, a massive insect head smashed through the ceiling a few meters ahead, the crumbling debris raising a cloud of dust as it hit the floor. The hell? Percy nearly stumbled backwards, dragging Nesha with him. He coughed, wanting to cover his mouth, but neither of his hands were free, forcing him to awkwardly use his shoulder instead. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of the intruder. Luckily, it didn't seem to have noticed them yet, still struggling to dig itself out of the hole. Yet, what little Percy could see was frightening enough. The bug's head was as large as his clone's thorax, meaning the creature's entire body was probably as big as an elephant. A starry night. It was his first time seeing one in person, though his clones had run into a few in the past. Not many, as they seemed much scarcer than their weaker relatives, at least in the sections of the hive he'd managed to access. Only a few seconds later did Nesha spot the oversized bug, Percy feeling her shudder. Part of him wanted to comfort her, but the priority right now was to figure out how to get past the monster in one piece. Will the disguise even hold? He openly wondered through the cord, letting his clone listen in. I don't know. All the wasps rely on the goo, but the higher grades are smarter too. Percy gritted his teeth. Bug or not, he didn't dare underestimate a green core's intelligence. Can you get us past it? He asked again. He'd considered turning back, but there was nowhere to go. His clone had only dug one exit to the surface, and this was the only tunnel leading to it. I can try. Then, realizing they were almost out of time, the knight having nearly extricated itself from the hole, the clone spat another mouthful of sludge on each of them for good measure. Next, it turned around to negotiate with its giant cousin. The creature had to scrunch up to fit inside the tunnel. It clearly wasn't meant for the green variants. Each of its movements scraped ores and crystals off the walls. Glancing at the group, it perked up, noticing something out of place. Not missing a beat, the clone stood before it, trying to block its view, as he opened his mandibles. The stench of rot and musk intensified further, as Percy's clone released more of it, this time in a gaseous form. Releasing a high-pitched screech that made Percy's ears hurt, the knight tried to brush the clone aside with its head, though the latter fought to stand his ground. Confused, the green wasp felt the clone with its antennae, probably trying to discern whether he was truly its kin. Though the knight seemed convinced, it still stubbornly tried to look past the clone, sensing something wrong. Percy held his breath throughout the whole ordeal, a quick glance revealing that Nesha was doing the same. Unable to hold on much longer, however, he ended up gasping for air a few seconds later, a whiff of the putrid stench nearly making him gag. Thinking of something, he let go of his partner's hand, much to her surprise, discreetly placing it behind his back, hidden behind the bandage. Luckily, the enchanted fabric was still in one piece, unlike many of the tattered rags they wore. Then he began gathering some soul mana just in case. The standoff continued for several minutes, as cold sweat trickled down his back. At some point, the knight seemed to back down a little, making Percy think it had finally agreed to let them go. Relaxing, he noticed the noxious odor had, at some point, given way to a different, less unpleasant scent. It was sweet, faintly reminding him of bananas. Shit. Run! The clone suddenly screamed through the connection. Chapter 108, Starry Night. With a violent snap of its mandibles, the knight tore nearly halfway through the clone's torso, before slamming him against the wall. Nesha stepped back, seemingly about to run away, when Percy stopped her. Don't! He yelled, not leaving room for debate. Putting aside whether they could outrun the creature, they couldn't risk diving back into the sea of bugs behind them. The knight could easily set the whole colony off. No, there was only one way out, and it was past the beast. The monster lunged towards them, its pillar-like legs punching craters in their wake, the rocky protrusions sticking out of the tunnel's surfaces barely hindering its advance. Out of time, Percy swung his right hand, launching the parting gift. A faint distortion passed through the air, spinning towards the bug. He'd poured everything in the attack, not leaving even a drop behind for soul vision. He'd have used circulation too if he had a few more seconds. Cree! The bug let out an otherworldly screech, even louder than before, as the invisible sickle found its mark, landing between its eyes. Percy counted his lucky stars that the narrow tunnel had robbed the knight of its greatest strength, its agility. He assumed he'd have never managed to hit it outdoors. Not if it was any faster than the soldiers, just as they were quicker than the workers. Missing a step, the monster stumbled on the ground, though its momentum continued to carry it forward at a dangerous speed. Thinking on his feet, Percy shoved Nesha against the wall, leaping towards the opposite one himself, hoping they'd fit in the gaps by the bug's sides. Mickey! Use circulation! Now! The impact shook him, though he'd made sure to absorb all of it with his body, still cognizant of the crow in his arms. Though that was only the beginning of his struggle, as the knight's limp frame finally reached him, pushing him against the hard stone. Percy instinctively pressed both knees and elbows against the wall, desperate to leave enough space for Mickey. He felt all his bones creak and crack as the rough carapace of the giant wasp peeled a layer of skin off his back. A-R-R-R-R-R-G-G-G-G-G-G-H-H-H-H-H. He screamed, enduring the pain as he did everything in his power to keep both himself and his familiar alive. Eventually, the wasp came to rest about halfway past him, its body still pressed against his own, though the weight was more bearable now that it wasn't moving. Well, for a while at least. Suddenly, the creature spasmed, sending a wave of force through him. It's still alive, Percy realized in horror. His parting gift had never failed before, at least not when he managed to land it. Then again, a 2-grade gap was probably too much to bridge, especially without circulation. The creature cried and squirmed, each tiny movement slamming into Percy with the force of a charging ram. He had no idea if Nesha had survived, but he didn't have the luxury to worry about her now. Taking advantage of the pauses between the bug's pain jolts, he crawled against the wall, ignoring his protesting limbs, trying to reach the rear of the creature before it recovered completely. Faster, he thought as its spasms grew more frequent. It was fortunate it lacked the awareness to attack him on purpose, as he doubted he'd survive any deliberate blows. Yet he understood it was just a matter of time until his luck ran out. He inhaled as much air as he could with every chance the creature gave him. His efforts stung, as a broken rib seemed to have pierced his lung, slowing down the process. At least, the extreme density of mana in the air helped, letting him slowly refill his cores despite the obstacles. A few seconds later, he found some space beneath the wasp's abdomen, finally letting him stretch his limbs a little. However, a new issue had arisen, giving him pause. Glinting by the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of the bug's stinger. The lethal weapon was longer than a lance, thick droplets of purple dripping from its tip. SSSSSS. A pool had already formed beneath it, and the acid seemed even more potent than that of the soldiers. Percy was standing a few steps away, yet the scarce vapor alone was enough to make his eyes burn and water, leaving an acrid aftertaste at the back of his throat. Just as he was contemplating how to best bypass it, the knight suddenly lashed out with a hind leg, sending him bouncing against the wall, before tumbling down a few meters behind it. Cough, cough. Percy's coughs were wet, and his body felt like it had been stomped on by a herd of buffaloes. At least I'm alive, he reasoned before registering that the bug had kindly helped him around the pool of acid. Thanks for that. Even better, a quick glance revealed that Mickey was okay. Rattled, yes, but otherwise unharmed. It was more than he could say about, shit, Nesha. Only now did he remember his companion, scanning his surroundings for her. Luckily, he didn't have to look far, as he found her sitting by a wall nearby, having also managed to escape the bug's clutches somehow. He was about to call out to her, when he noticed her condition. She had a hand pressed against her right temple, a stream of red seeping through her fingers. One of her eyes was closed, the other sporting a vacant gaze. There were several more cuts and bruises throughout her body, though her blood was mixed with a different liquid. A green one. Wasp blood. Percy recognized it, having encountered it countless times while hunting. There was no mistaking it, as it gleamed in a brighter shade than his clone's vomit. A piercing screech reminded him they weren't out of the woods quite yet, as the knight had stood up again, and it was trying to turn around. Breathing faster, Percy hoped to activate circulation in time. The boosting art put a strain on one's body, which wasn't an issue for him normally, but his current state made everything a challenge. Synchronization is definitely out of the question, he noted, as he watched the wasp claw some extra space out of the walls so it could turn. That was when Percy spotted some nasty gashes by its side, a bright green liquid oozing out of its exoskeleton. It's injured. Checking Nesha's core with mana sense, he saw it was empty. She'd probably used everything she had to extricate herself from the creature, wounding it in the process. The bug finally managed to orient itself, its compound eyes locking onto Percy, sending a shiver down his spine. "I suppose it'll have to do," he thought as a silver maelstrom came to life underneath his skin. He hadn't bothered to use his second core, as he knew the pure mana wouldn't even put a dent on the knight's carapace. Plus, Percy's body couldn't handle another round of boosting right now. Placing Mickey on the ground, he briefly considered asking him to help, though he quickly shot the idea down. While the crow was in a better state than him, it didn't have anything in its arsenal that would make a difference here. It wouldn't even be able to fly properly inside the narrow tunnel. Realizing it was all up to him, he manifested 2 silver sickles, each larger than the one before. The bug was about to charge towards him, but Percy wouldn't give it the chance to pick up speed a second time. Unleashing both of his weapons, he watched as they stabbed his opponent's soul. It had clearly learned its lesson, however, jerking its head at the last second to ensure only one of the constructs landed on it, letting the other hit its torso. The projectiles definitely hurt. Still, the monstrosity simply refused to collapse. It lashed erratically against the tunnel with everything it had, limbs, stinger and mandibles, causing chunks of stone larger than Percy's head to fall all over the place. The young man had no choice but to jump around, while keeping an eye out for Nesha and Mickey both, ready to intercept a rock with a blast of cyan if he had to. At the same time, he rushed to replenish his soul mana, preparing to hit the wasp again. But it wasn't going down that easily, it seemed. Snapping out of its frenzy sooner than last time, it crawled towards Percy, hell-bent on chomping down the annoying pests that dared to injure it. Percy wanted to run. Unlike before, the exit was behind him. Still, he was in a worse shape than the creature. It would definitely catch up. Besides, he couldn't leave the others at its mercy. "Then, just die already!" he yelled, launching another sickle with what mana he'd managed to recover. It hit, but the wasp kept coming. "Die!" He threw one more, draining his channels out too, bringing him right out of circulation. This one halted the knight's movements, causing it to fall to its side, the impact sending a shockwave through the cavern. Yet, the horror wasn't quite over, as the bug's limbs twitched just moments later, letting it resume its march. "Just D." The young man screamed between strained breaths, resorting to random blobs of pure mana that splattered harmlessly against the creature. Naturally, they did nothing. Looming over him, the wasp looked like it was about to pounce, when someone interfered. "My clone!" Percy had written the soldier off, as he was in the worst condition out of everyone in the tunnel. By far. His upper body was barely held together by a few scant shards of chitin, though that hadn't been enough to put the clone out of commission, apparently. Having waited for the knight to walk right over him, he bit at one of its legs, hugging it tightly. Then, he plunged his stinger right into the wound Nesha had inflicted, pumping the monster's carapace full of acid. Screeching in agony once more, the green bug stomped on the clone's head with a different leg, this time crushing it directly. It only took a moment for the soul fragment to slam into Percy, flooding his mind with memories. The young man forcefully brushed them aside, however. This wasn't the time to sort them out. Having exhausted all his trump cards, Percy stared at the beast, his expression grim. He knew he couldn't retreat another step. Nesha was right behind him, tightening his grip around a half-formed sickle. He prepared for his final stand against the bug. Satisfied with its handiwork, the knight tossed the broken clone aside, turning back toward Percy. It opened its jaw wide, sending a rain of spittle at him. Man and insect looked each other in the eyes, both keenly aware that only one of them would survive. At best. Chapter 109 Regal Intent. The knight's mandibles opened wide, preparing to chomp the pesky human in half. Reading his adversary's intentions via soul vision, the young man was ready to crouch beneath the monster at a moment's notice, clenching the half-formed sickle tightly in his fist. Yet just as they were about to clash, something strange happened. The beast's body suddenly relaxed, its expression easing. Now what? At first, Percy thought it was an act. a ruse to get him to drop his guard. But he doubted the creature was that smart. Besides, it didn't really need to trick him to end this. Honestly, his odds of surviving the frontal assault of the elephant-sized beast were abysmal. More importantly, he could see the wasp's bloodlust had all but evaporated, not finding any trace of hostility in its soul. Who cares? Whatever the reason was, he wouldn't waste his chance. Swinging his weapon at the knight's face, he gouged another deep wound into its soul. What was it, the sixth now? An advantage of fighting in close range was that he could more easily maintain his constructs. A chunk of it still crumbled away, but he needed less mana to repair it than to form a new one, soon delivering another strike after the first. No reaction. For some reason, the towering monster that had savagely fought to slaughter them all just minutes ago was now standing motionless, eating Percy's attacks with no intention of fighting back. Has it lost consciousness or something? He wondered, as the silver maelstrom finally formed within his torso once more. Yet, just when he was about to redouble his efforts to slay the knight, another change occurred. A spark of intelligence suddenly flashed inside its compound eyes, gazing at the young man not with hatred or hunger, but curiosity. Percy shivered, leaping backwards by instinct. He knew his best course of action was to continue hacking at the monster, but his body refused to listen, a primal wave of terror now coursing through it. Somehow, the bug's pensive look was even more frightening than its previous demeanor. But the wasp didn't stop there. Tilting its head, it unleashed a suffocating aura inside the narrow corridor. Physically, nothing happened. Percy didn't need to use mana sense to see the colorful motes dancing through the air like before, many of them flowing towards him. The bug hadn't moved an inch from its spot either. Still, he couldn't help but feel like he was stuck in amber, as a palpable presence flooded the cavern, holding him in place. No green beast should be able to exert this kind of tangible authority. It felt almost regal. Shit. It appeared the Starry Queen had taken notice of their actions. Percy had no clue why she had stopped the knight from killing him, or why she seemed intent on capturing them alive. And honestly, he wasn't interested in finding out. Summoning every shred of willpower, he fought to twitch his thumb, eventually managing to point it towards his palm. Then, he pushed some soul mana through it, extending a sharp point off its tip. Gaff. The pain was immense, but it worked. Gritting his teeth, he intensified his breaths as he formed another sickle in his right hand, still stabbing himself with his left. "Go to hell already!" he yelled, dashing towards the creature. It raised two forelimbs to stop him, though Percy saw its reaction coming from a mile away. He didn't know if the previous damage had slowed the wasp's movements, or if it was the queen's control over her subject that was clumsy, but it worked in his favor either way. Crouching beneath the knight's legs, he slid underneath its carapace, as he relied on his momentum to slice a long line through its soul. If a dozen small attacks weren't enough to take it down, Percy would have to go big. The rough floor of the tunnel further shredded his already injured back, but he didn't let the pain dull his offensive. The sickle's edge met a lot of resistance. It was like trying to chop a tree with a rusty axe. But Percy wasn't deterred. He kept flooding his weapon with mana, as his core and channels emptied again, bringing him out of circulation a second time. In the end, the construct shattered right around the wasp's sternum, Percy's body coming to a halt not much further. He wasn't sure if that had been enough, but he knew he shouldn't remain in that spot either way. Kicking against a rocky protrusion, he rolled to the side, colliding violently against the wall. And just in time too. With a deafening sound, the heavy carapace of the colossal bug fell limp on the floor, countless cracks spreading out from the impact. Instinctively, Percy wanted to hold his breath until the results came in, though he knew the fastest way to check if the beast was alive was to gather enough mana for soul vision. And a few seconds later, he had his answer. He finally exhaled in relief, plopping back onto a hard crystal. It hurt a bit, but not as much as everything else. Still, Percy ignored his protesting body, pushing himself up. There was no time to waste. Limping towards Nesha, he placed two fingers on her neck, checking for a pulse. It was faint, but she was alive. Not for much longer, though. Luckily, he had the means to save her. Reaching for the spatial amulet around his neck.
No.
No, 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 no. His heart skipped a beat upon realizing it wasn't there. Shit. Where is it? The artifact contained everything. From the 2 years' worth of ingredients he'd painstakingly accumulated, to the healing potions he needed to save his partner's life. Hell, without them, he wasn't sure he'd be in any condition to escape the tunnel himself, before the Queen sent her troops after him. Percy scanned his surroundings, looking for the pendant. He had to find it, and he had to do it fast. He still wasn't sure what the Queen wanted from him. Perhaps she had seen how useful circulation was, or maybe she just wanted to kill him personally. Either way, the sea of bugs they had left behind was only a few hours away, and that was assuming there weren't any other nearby tunnels filled with the darn things. It didn't take a genius to guess they were probably all heading their way already. It all depends on when I dropped it. Had it happened back when the wasps were crawling all over them, there would be no retrieving it. His only hope was to have lost it during the fight with the knight. But the odds of that being the case were swiftly fading as he failed to spot it anywhere around him. Maybe it's under the corpse. The only thing more difficult than walking back to the knight was lifting its oversized carcass. Percy's limbs were already purple and swollen. Even the slightest exertion resulted in a series of popping sounds all over his body. Still, he persisted, knowing he wasn't getting out of here without that amulet. Reactivating circulation was torture. To make matters worse, a single application didn't seem to be enough. Gritting his teeth, he pushed as much mana into his channels as his body could handle, eventually managing to budge the knight slightly. This thing must weigh 6 tons. It took everything he had and then some, only to roll the body a couple inches to the side. Percy was starting to lose all hope when he finally caught a glimpse of a dark object about a meter to his left. Ha 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 ha! He laughed like a madman, his sheer joy giving him the strength to lift the carapace just a little more. Mickey! Grab it! Fast! The bird didn't need to be told twice, eagerly fluttering towards the artifact, happy to finally be useful. Percy hadn't had the time to think about it earlier, but he knew the crow had felt guilty letting him fight on his own, unable to help. Only after the familiar retrieved the pendant did Percy lower the corpse again, falling back weakly. Mickey then brought him the object, as he wasn't in any condition to move. Confirming that it wasn't damaged, the young man stuck his thumb on one of the cube's faces, releasing 3 brief pulses of pure mana. He didn't know if these enchantments worked with every affinity, but they certainly did with his. The cube emitted a satisfying sound, before expanding several-fold, reaching the size of a crate. The same side he had just tapped then opened, revealing a stash of tools and vials within. Most of them contained a turquoise liquid, but those weren't the ones he needed. There! He exclaimed, clumsily pulling a handful of green potions out. Sadly, he hadn't bought too many of them, only a couple dozen. Given the state of their injuries, he wasn't sure they'd suffice. Nesha was at yellow and the potions had grown less effective on him too, ever since his second core advanced. If only I had known. He smiled bitterly, but he couldn't have. Not about the divine root forcing them to leave 2 years in advance, and not about the Starry Night beating them within an inch of their life. He shook his head. There was no point regretting things he couldn't change, nor any time for it. Uncorking 3 of the vials in quick succession, he quickly guzzled their contents down, hoping they'd fix him up enough to move. I'll only drink more if Nesha doesn't need them. His wounds itched as the potions took effect, though it was modest as expected. Still, he did feel a little better about a minute later, able to move his limbs again. Making his way to his companion, he soon panicked upon seeing how pale she was, her skin cold as ice. Lifting her chin, he helped her swallow potion after potion, only pausing after the 6th one. Come on, he muttered, biting his lip. Scanning her intently, he saw many of her wounds begin to close, though that didn't seem to be enough. She didn't regain consciousness either. He fed her another 4 potions, drinking a few more himself. Finally, her injuries faded away as did his own. She's still not waking up. Turning soul vision on, he examined her again. She was right on the verge, bad enough that he could probably possess her if he wanted, though not completely beyond the pale. He did have a few more potions, though this wasn't something life mana could fix. But I can. Pouring all his soul mana into her, he did mend the injuries slightly. Given enough time, he should be able to heal her completely. Yet time was the one commodity they were swiftly running out of. He could speed things up with circulation, but his own soul wasn't exactly healthy either. The night, he remembered. With Mickey's help, the colossal carcass could provide them all the soul mana they needed, and then some. The only problem was getting through its hard exoskeleton. Neither his pure constructs nor Mickey's talons could pierce it. Examining the corpse, Percy's gaze briefly lingered on the wound Nesha had inflicted. However, his clone had filled it with acid, rendering it too dangerous for the crow. Then there was the soldier's body too, but it was a lower grade. It had also died even earlier and more thoroughly. There wouldn't be anything left. Mickey, Percy called to his familiar, thinking of something. CW? The bird gave him a questioning look. I need your help, but you aren't going to like it. Caw. Caw. Mickey replied resolutely, eager to contribute however he could. Go into the night's mouth and eat its soul from inside. Chapter 110 Devourer. The crow remained silent, staring at the young man as if he had lost his mind. Please, buddy, can you do this for me? Mickey looked back and forth between Percy and the carcass a few times, seemingly pondering the request. Eventually, he begrudgingly hopped towards the bug, resigned to his fate. Pushing a mandible open with his talon, he crouched inside the gaping maw, disappearing into the dead knight's horrid throat. Letting his familiar do his thing, the young man turned to Nesha again, watching her with bated breath. Luckily, he didn't have to wait long. Soon, a flood of soul mana gushed through the connection, filling up his frame. It was a lot. Too much, even. Without missing a beat, he poured everything into the girl, until she couldn't handle another drop. Both his and her wounds greedily drank the tonic as fast as they could, though more kept rushing in, forcing him to spill it out of his pores. It was a waste, but he couldn't help it. The two remained like that for several minutes, their frames saturated with mana, slowly but steadily patching them up. Please work, he whispered, not knowing if anyone could hear him. Well, Nesha seemed to. Her eyelids twitched, before she finally opened her eyes weakly. Regaining their luster, her pupils darted around a little, before locking onto Percy. She blinked a few times, and then spoke. Have you seen my glasses? The young man was taken aback by the question. Instinctively, he shook his head. While the sturdy amulet had survived the violent fight, he doubted the glasses would be equally lucky. They hadn't packed any spares either. At least we have some extra clothes. That was when Percy jerked his head away, only now registering their bodies were barely covered. Nesha looked confused for a second, though her cheeks lit up with a rosy tint a moment later. Sifting through the cube, the young man handed her a fresh change, before wearing another pair of trousers himself. He was out of shirts, however, so he'd have to go around bare-chested for the time being. Another thing I would have bought if we had more time, he sighed. Percy stood before helping Nesha up too. Let's go. We only have an hour to get out of here, if we're lucky. What about the night? What happened? Nesha asked, looking around. Soon, she saw the giant wasp. It was kind of hard to miss, her body visibly tensing at the sight. A couple seconds passed before she found the courage to approach it, to examine it more closely, her poor eyesight not doing her any favors. Realizing it was dead, her expression twisted into an odd blend of shock and relief, as she turned to Percy, clearly ready to unleash a barrage of questions. Later, he dismissed with a wave, before calling out to his familiar. Come on, Mickey. You did great, buddy. But we've got to go now. No response. Percy waited a moment before trying again. Mickey? Caw. The bird finally replied, though it sounded odd. Lethargic perhaps, or bloated? Considering a possibility, the color drained from Percy's face. Don't tell me. The familiar sent him a series of images, confirming his fears. It was eating a path through the wasp's flesh when it spotted something glowing in the darkness. It was an orb thrumming in an intense amber color green through mana sense. Unable to resist, the bird pecked at it and it wasn't hard to guess what happened next. Here. Now. Percy panicked, though in hindsight he should have seen this coming. He'd already known the crow would overtake him sooner or later, and it had spent the last 3 years stuffing its face full of orange and yellow cores. Dozens of them per day even. It would have been stranger if the knight's core hadn't pushed it over the edge. Still, Nesha, he shouted, startling the poor girl. Change of plans. I have to stay here a while longer, but we can't have you wait with me. What? Why? What? Percy pinched the bridge of his nose, thinking of the best way to explain it. Keep heading down the tunnel until you reach the end. Don't worry about losing the way. It's just a straight path towards the exit. There aren't any more forks. Once you get there, you'll find yourself at a dead end. A dead end? Nesha asked in horror. It's not as bad as it sounds. It should only be around a dozen meters from the surface. We never finished digging the tunnel, because we hadn't expected to escape from the guild so soon. My plan was to have the wasp dig us out, though that isn't an option anymore. Percy gestured at his broken clone, whose memories he was still suppressing. In any case, you're a yellow. I'm sure you can dig us out with a few spells. He explained. What about you? I'll meet you as soon as I can, but you need to get a move on. We won't have enough time to expand the tunnel later, so I'm counting on you to get it done by then. The girl stared at him in silence for a couple seconds, letting his words sink in. Percy could practically see the questions bubbling up, but, understanding the urgency of the situation, she didn't voice them. In the end, she simply nodded, before placing her hand by the wall to orient herself, heading off. Only then did Percy turn back towards the carcass. Well, Mickey, whatever you're doing, just hurry up. Activating mana sense, he examined the dead knight, observing his familiar's advancement. The wasp's body itself was now void of mana. Whatever had remained in its channels was already gone, its core consumed. The crow was the only thing still visible within Percy's sixth sense. The carapace did obscure it slightly, but a core's advancement was a difficult thing to hide. Mickey's entire silhouette shone in a vibrant orange color. His core burned a shade brighter, filled with strands of yellow twisting and rolling within. More of them appeared each second, as they joined and banded together in a familiar manner. Not fast enough. Thinking of something, Percy walked to his clone's remains, picking a broken chunk off the ground. The gruesome piece of flesh was tough to identify, but he was almost sure it contained the creature's core. Scanning it, he confirmed it was indeed there, though more than half had already crumbled, the rest of it dim. Oh well, every little helps. He shrugged, tossing it into the knight's mouth. The bird complained, of course. It didn't exactly have room for dessert, though it ultimately acquiesced, probably recognizing through Percy's tone he wasn't in the mood for nonsense. As expected, the extra push increased the pressure in Mickey's sternum, forcing the strands to fuse faster. The young man estimated it would be done in a couple minutes. Sadly, their time had already run out. Everything shook, from the shimmering crystals filled with mana, to the colorful ores lodged in the cavern's walls, to the corpses of the 2 bugs, all the way to Percy's very bones. Feeling the vibrations coursing through him, he could tell the army of insects was already upon them, his body oozing cold sweat. Then he heard their wings. There were countless of them, their incessant buzzing echoing through the vast cavern, growing louder by the second. Looking at the carcass again, Percy saw it shrivel and sink, as Mickey had already moved to the second phase of his advancement, his core shining in a bright yellow. Honestly, the young man was tempted to grab the bird right then and there, getting the hell out while he still could. No, I don't know what happens if a beast doesn't get the food it needs after evolving. He had no idea if they'd find enough outside. They might even run into other problems there. Unwilling to place his familiar at risk, he allowed him to continue devouring the starry night, turning its flesh into his own. Percy's heart did ache a little at the sight, as he couldn't help but imagine the green clone he could have crafted out of the corpse. But that was just a pipe dream. He hadn't had the luxury of taking it easy on the creature to leave its body intact, nor to spend hours using his bloodline inside the hive. Feeding it to Mickey was the best use for it. Shaking the distracting thoughts out of his mind, he took a deep breath and then another, drawing the shimmering motes into both cores, preparing to fight. The first bugs to appear were the workers. While the wasps grew faster with each grade, that was provided they were free to fly. Within the tight walls of the hive, a different dynamic manifested. Nothing above orange had enough space to stretch its wings, so this wave of insects was the quickest to reach him. Gritting his teeth, Percy formed a sickle in each hand, as two sets of glowing lines lit up underneath his skin. But he didn't stop there. Now that he'd managed to heal his flesh and soul both, he pushed the boosting arts to their very limits. As his muscles bulged and his skin reddened, a twin halo of cyan and silver shrouding his frame. Next, he poured even more mana into his weapons, sharpening them and growing them another touch, as he stared intently at the depths of the tunnel ahead. And finally, the dense river of fox-sized wasps appeared, rushing him in all their maddened fury, as Percy pounced into the swarm, determined to survive. Chapter 111 Slaughter. Percy had come a long way since joining the Alchemist's Guild. He'd learned a lot and honed many of his spells over the years, though if there were two things he'd gained the most experience in, well, it would be brewing elixirs and killing wasps. The latter was precisely the skill he was currently exercising, to survive the onslaught of starry workers rushing him like a torrential river amidst a downpour. Most of them were headed to their doom, of course, but the mad beasts didn't seem to care, heeding their ruler's command without complaint. Horizontal slice. 5 dead. Vertical slash. 3 more. Sidestep and swing. Another 2 killed and 1 attack evaded. There's no end to them. It had already been over 5 minutes since the bugs reached him, and Mickey had yet to finish mutating. From the fleeting images he sent over, Percy could tell the knight's carcass was already halfway eaten. He wasn't sure the rest would suffice. But he didn't exactly have the time to worry about that, as he was busy trying to prevent the creatures from getting past him. The workers never truly stood a chance against his oversized sickles, the crescent edges slicing the wasps' very souls apart like hot knives through morsels of butter. The constructs were frankly overkill for the job, as was the young man's speed and ferocity, rendering the poor creatures without any means of defending themselves. Thus, no single insect posed a problem by itself, though their sheer numbers did. With a diameter of nearly 3 meters, the tunnel was more than wide enough for a dozen workers to arrive at once without bumping into one another. Moreover, they dove upon him in waves spaced apart by mere fractions of a second, never giving him a moment to catch his breath. At least the dead ones are blocking the way. Percy smiled bitterly. So many had he slain already, that their fox-sized corpses littered his surroundings, forming multiple large mounds. It was to the point some of the oncoming insects had to waste time flying around or digging through their fallen comrades, relaxing the pressure on him slightly. Of course, every now and then, one of them crashed violently onto the piles of bodies, sending their limp frames tumbling through the tunnel. Is it me? Or are they deliberately not using their stingers? Given his recent advancement, the upgraded boosting art, and his many years of experience, Percy was doing a decent job holding on. That said, he couldn't help but notice he owed some of his success to his enemies not giving their all. Their endgame was to bypass and overwhelm him from every direction, apparently still intent on capturing him alive. Just what does she want from me? The mere thought of being delivered as a prisoner to the titanic monster would have sent a chill down his spine, if only synchronization wasn't cooking his body inside out. "Caw!" Mickey suddenly cried. It was hard to make his voice out through the cacophony of the buzzing wasps and the endless rumble of the tunnel. Still, Percy could have sworn it sounded a little deeper and slightly more piercing than before. "Are you done yet?" he asked through the cord, too occupied to turn around. Taking the hint, The crow used the connection this time, sending him another glimpse of the knight's carcass. Only a chunk remained, though it was the part Percy's clone had filled with acid. Mickey couldn't eat that, and it appeared the bird still needed some food to finish evolving. Damn! Percy spat through gritted teeth. Just eat the smaller ones. They're all over the place. Intensifying his efforts, he advanced through the chaotic corridor, leaving his cover behind. Slaughtering a path through the workers' ranks, the young man turned into a violent hurricane of flesh and soul, his weapons unleashed in a lethal flurry against the insects. The incessant buzzing gave way to the rhythmic sounds of dead bodies, some making dull noises as they crashed against stones and metals, a few forming crisp tunes as they collided with the crystals instead. Step by step, slash by slash, Percy pushed back the rush of beasts with sheer grit and force of will, his muscles burning and his bones aching as he left a graveyard in his wake. Well, what's the hold-up? Fortunately, it didn't take Mickey much longer to complete his transformation. The giant corpse had left him very close, and the veritable buffet Percy had prepared for him was more than enough to seal the deal. But it wasn't all good news. A fleeting glance revealed the crow was now as tall as a human. It had already been impossible for it to fly inside the narrow tunnel before, yet now even fluttering through it was out of the question. Just run then. Percy felt like banging his head against the wall. Do I look like I can carry you? Caw. The bird didn't sound particularly happy, but then again, it wasn't the one that had to keep an army at bay. Jolting off, it disappeared into the colorful corridor as Percy also backtracked, conceding some ground to the insects to keep up with his familiar. Under different circumstances, the young man might have found the bird's awkward dash hilarious. Mickey actually looking like a chicken as he skittered through the tunnel. This wasn't the time to laugh at the crow's antics, however, as another change occurred with his attackers. The second platoon was upon him. Spilling into the tunnel, the drones filled in the gaps between the workers, blotting out Percy's view. Pathetically weak as they were, he knew he could crush each of them with a finger. If only he had a few hundred fingers. This is going to suck. As the cloud of palm-sized wasps reached him, he made the split-second decision to ignore them entirely, focusing his mana sense solely on the orange creatures. Continuing as before, he simply allowed the drones to do as they pleased, many latching onto his body, as a few made their way to his familiar. "KRA!" the bird cried in annoyance, shaking the bugs off with a powerful flap of its wings as a series of amber lines lit up on its plumage. Percy, on the other hand, was having a tougher time, as he was neither a beast nor at yellow. The blanket of insects crawled all over his skin, inhibiting his joints, trying to slow down his movements. "Piss off!" he shouted, sending a powerful burst of psi and out of his pores, blasting the pests to smithereens. His pure mana might have not been that useful against the knight or the workers, but for the drones, it was plenty. And thus, they continued, a man and a bird, desperately inching towards the exit, struggling to resist the suffocating grasp of the magical hive trying to steal their freedom. How much further is it? They must have run for half an hour like this, and Percy wasn't sure he'd last much longer. While he'd grown far more proficient with synchronization over the past few months, he'd never fought at such intensity and for such a prolonged period of time. Yet, even more than his dwindling stamina, Percy had another thing to be worried about. The tremors beneath his feet had grown fiercer, indicating the soldiers were about to reach them too. Luckily, there didn't seem to be another knight nearby, or it would have long caught up by now. Still, it wasn't like he felt confident handling a legion of the yellow creatures in his current state. "Caw!" Mickey suddenly called out to him ecstatically, sending a vivid image through the cord. It was bright, but different than the magical glimmer of the cavern. Sunlight. They'd reached the exit. Moreover, the fact the sun could peer into the tunnel meant Nesha had succeeded too, digging them a way out of this infernal death trap. "Hurry up," Percy said, the literal light at the end of the tunnel renewing his vigor. "We need to get there before the soldiers reach us." "Caw!" Keenly aware of the danger they were in, the two drew on any lingering dregs of strength they'd yet to tap into, hoping to make it in time. But they weren't fast enough. Shit, they're here. Percy's heart skipped a beat as the first hint of yellow appeared in his mana sense. Realizing the soldiers would get to him before he made it out, he decided to change tactics. Fighting the workers one-armed, he allowed the sickle in his other hand to transform, soon taking the shape of half a dozen throwing stars. Next, he launched them towards the bugs, the projectiles piercing long lines through his enemies, killing scores of them as they flew into the distance. This seemed to ease the pressure on him momentarily, letting him manifest a sheet of cyan in his now free hand, as he continued to hold off the rest of the wasps with the other. Finally, he flung the cloth of pure mana against the creatures, ensnaring many of them and forcing them to collide, before turning the second sickle into another set of projectiles and throwing that too. Here goes nothing. Having exhausted all the mana he could spare while retaining his boosting art, he then turned around, sprinting towards his familiar. Picking him up, he slung him awkwardly over his shoulder, before crossing the last few meters separating them from the exit. And without even waiting until he took his first step out of the hellish tunnel, he called to his partner. Nasha! Collapse the entrance! Now! Catching a glimpse of a dark shape by the corner of his eye, he barely ducked in time to avoid the bolt as it crashed onto the ceiling. Crack! Crack! Boom! Percy didn't bother glancing back at the aftermath as he leapt out of the cave, hoping the girl had poured everything into the spell. What the hell is that? She asked upon seeing Mickey. But the young man didn't register her words, only now managing to examine the devastation behind him. The bolt of space mana had done its job, shattering a layer of stone off the ceiling, leading to a cascading demolition. Still, this wasn't going to hold them off for long. He was certain the wasps were already busy clawing their way out. No time to waste, he told his companions as he picked a handful of dirt off the ground. Scrub your bodies with it. Their only shot at survival hinged on eliminating their trail. No way they'd outrun the wasps in an open space. The others followed his advice, even Mickey tossing a few beakfuls of mud onto his plumage. Finishing first, Percy helped the crow speed up the process as he noticed a dark bandage hung over its neck. Wow! Did you actually remember to take it off before advancing? That was quite some foresight from the bird. Percy had been too busy to think about that, but had his familiar evolved with it still wrapped around his abdomen, they'd be in need of a new one by now. Caw! Mickey said, flashing him an annoyed, I'm not a moron look. A minute later, the entire group was done masking their scent. And just in time too. The loose pebbles resting atop the recently collapsed entrance were already shaking violently, intense tremors seeping through the ground. Good. Now let's get the hell out of here. Chapter 112 Mutations. The trio ran for hours until they felt safe enough to take a break. And even then, they only gave themselves a few minutes to catch their breath and rub some more dirt on, before resuming their journey until nightfall. Perhaps the green or blue bugs could still track them down, but Percy guessed the queen wouldn't bother sending her elites that far from the hive. Do you see anything suspicious? He asked his familiar. Ever since they exited the tunnel, he'd had Mickey fly lower than usual, to ensure he didn't get spotted by anyone on the spire. It wasn't until the colossal structure was naught but a distant silhouette on the horizon that he gave him permission to climb higher, acting as a scout.
No.
Percy's eyebrows shot up. What? No. The bird repeated. The young man was sure he hadn't misheard. His familiar hadn't merely transmitted his thoughts. He'd sent an actual word over. Of course, the bird hadn't uttered a sound. It was all in Percy's mind. But Mickey had talked through their connection in a high-pitched, childlike voice. Can you speak normally now? No. Percy frowned. What words do you understand?
No.
Yes. Percy. Mickey. Eat. Fly. The bird kept going for a while until the young man cut it off. Okay. I get it. I guess this is something to work on. Mickey's vocabulary wasn't too varied, and it didn't seem like he could form a complete sentence just yet. But this was promising. While he might have been able to achieve all this even before the evolution, it would have probably taken more effort. As expected, The promotion had boosted Mickey's intelligence. All advancements did that to an extent, but not as much as other aspects of one's existence. For instance, while Percy's thoughts had grown a little clearer upon reaching Orange, he certainly hadn't turned 3 times as smart or anything crazy like that. Still, as far as he knew, beasts tended to benefit more than sentients in this regard, and he had a hunch his familiar was an outlier even among them. After all, he doubted other beasts started to speak upon hitting yellow, though he wouldn't rule it out for the higher grades. Are his old memories beginning to resurface? Percy sure hoped that was the case. At least, this was the first real sign his friend was on the road to recovery. However, it had taken them nearly 5 years to reach this point, so if the past was any indication, it was going to be a long road. Oh well, for now, let's just teach him a few more words and see if he can actually speak them out. But I suppose that has more to do with his vocal cords than his intelligence. In any case, this wasn't the only change Mickey had undergone during his advancement. As early as back in the tunnel, Percy had noticed some additional differences in his appearance, besides the obvious size increase, though he hadn't had the time to dwell on them. Now that they were finally free, he could examine them in more detail. "Mickey, come over here." Hearing him, the familiar dove downward at great speed, partly to show off, and partly to simply revel in his newfound strength, as he had been doing ever since they escaped the claustrophobic walls of the underground cavern. He landed in front of the young man, raising a cloud of dust with a flap of his wings. Percy rolled his eyes at the theatrics as he stepped closer, scanning the crow's body carefully. The color has spread to cover the entire talons and beak. Even his eyes are completely silver now. Just like the last time, Mickey's nature as a familiar seemed to have bled into the rest of his being, furthering his evolution towards this unique direction. They'd have to test the sharpness of the bird's claws in an actual fight, but Percy suspected they were on par with his sickles now. However, the crow's abnormal soul wasn't the only thing to have induced some unexpected mutations. Looking closely, the young man noticed Mickey's plumage had undergone a subtle shift too. The dark feathers were now tinged with a hint of green at the edges. The difference was minuscule, barely perceptible under the soft moonlight, but Percy knew his friend well enough to spot it. Is it because of his air affinity? Nobody could answer that, of course, as Mickey was possibly the only beast in the universe to have a second core. They were pretty much in uncharted territory. Still, this sounded about right. Nothing else could explain this oddity. In fact, Percy had a hypothesis as to why the crow was mutating in such a manner. This must be how affinity fusion works for beast mana. They'd tried to combine Mickey's 2 mana types before, though they'd never succeeded. At first, Percy had chalked it up to the mismatch between the 2 grades, though he was now confident there was more to it than that. Even on its own, the beast affinity seemed to revolve entirely around empowering and transforming its user's body. Perhaps all its fusions involved incorporating other mana types into the body, resulting in mutations like this. Percy felt his speculation was close to the truth, though at the end of the day it didn't really matter. Whatever the cause of these changes, the most important thing was figuring out how to take advantage of them. "Can you gather some air mana on your feathers?" Mickey heeded the request, releasing a faint green aura by the underside of his wings. Percy had watched him do this many times before, but it was different now. Bathed in the air mana, the crow's feathers lit up, apparently resonating with the substance. Activating mana sense, the young man observed a layer of red coating them, sticking to them without dispersing. "Fly?" the bird asked, clearly eager to put its new trick to the test. "Fly." Percy nodded. Taking off, the crow sped through the night once more, this time doing so with even greater ease as the air seemed to part in its way, aiding rather than hindering it. "Interesting," the young man noted. It wasn't the first time Mickey used his second affinity to augment his flight, but the effect had never been quite as pronounced. This, in tandem with circulation and just the overall boost from the advancement, and the crow was guaranteed to be a menace in aerial combat. "Are you two done playing around?" Nesha asked in annoyance, snapping Percy out of his thoughts. The girl had remained oddly quiet since their frantic escape, apparently contemplating a great number of things during their journey. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions," Percy said. Honestly, he felt a little guilty over letting her join without knowing much about him. It was true she'd followed him of her own volition, but, in hindsight, he should have probably come clean beforehand. Between Mickey, his clone, circulation, and his second core, there was plenty he'd have to bring her up to speed with. "I do." She nodded, but then shook her head. "There's only one thing I want to know right now, however." Percy tilted his head, waiting for her to elaborate. "Where are we going?" That. They hadn't really discussed their plans for after leaving the settlement. Had they? In Percy's defense, it was a miracle they'd even survived this long. "Well, I did have a place in mind," he said. "It's a small town about 2 weeks from here. I have my reasons for going there. Unless you wanted to go somewhere else." "No, that sounds fine. Anywhere is good, as long as I can buy a new pair of glasses." Percy's jaw slackened upon hearing what her priority was. "Though I suppose I'd also want that if I couldn't see properly." Shrugging, Percy gestured at her to follow him as he strayed away from the dirt path. The road was easier to walk on, but it wasn't the safest place to camp the night. Moving a couple 100 meters, they made their way around a hill, hoping to rest behind it, hidden from plain sight until sunrise. "Take the first shift, will you?" he asked Mickey. It was a rhetorical question. Percy knew he deserved some sleep after fighting a damn army of wasps for his familiar's sake. Picking a nice-looking patch of dirt, he patted it a few times to soften it before lying down. Sadly, they hadn't brought any camping equipment, as the amulet had only had enough space for some food and water. But it was okay. With his enhanced physique, even weathering the frigid midnight winds with his bare chest shouldn't be too difficult. Thinking of something, he turned to Nesha, who was also preparing her own resting spot, before speaking. "I thought advancing fixed things like poor eyesight." "It does. You should have seen me at Orange." Chapter 113 Search. "What do you mean you can't find anything?" Deimos's voice boomed, the entire room shaking. The idiot in his grip trembled as he was held by the collar, not even daring to blink as the spittle splashed all over his face. "Yes, sir. We've searched the settlement inside out. We've already interrogated all the registered alchemists, too. Nobody knows anything about this Aurora Dew. Or well, at least nothing they're willing to share." Deimos felt his blood freeze at the mere thought of returning to his father empty-handed. Hermes might have given the rest of Remir the impression of an easygoing eccentric, but Deimos knew the truth about the fickle god. If he failed to deliver the elixirs, his father might just beat him to death. "Look again. Leave no stone unturned. Interrogate everyone from the most senior alchemists to the lowest redborn trash selling junk food on the streets. Don't show your ugly mug to me again, unless you have something useful to report," he yelled, tossing him out of the room. The fool was lucky he still needed him. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Deimos then walked out of the temporary lodging the guild had so kindly bestowed him, eager for some fresh air. At least the mana density was rich here, the only silver lining in a mission too troublesome to be worth it. Walking along the cobblestone road, he breathed the colorful motes in, trying to calm himself down. A few minutes later, he reached a grand building, one of the largest in the settlement, climbing up its stone steps. Upon seeing him, an attendant in a green robe rushed to greet him, but Deimos just waved him away. "I know the way. But sir, the elders are currently in a meeting. I'm sure if you why. No meeting is more important than this. Your elders know that too." Without even waiting for the man to reply, Deimos walked past him, making his way to a large chamber. The door had been left wide open. He could see the 5 old alchemists locked in a heated discussion from here, though no sound escaped, as the room was clearly warded. Another attendant was stationed outside, the man looking at him in hesitation, probably considering whether he should try stopping him. But Deimos didn't care, ignoring him as he entered the hall. The elders went silent upon noticing him, their features twisting into a grimace following his rude entrance. Dressed in their violet robes as they were, It had probably been centuries since the last time anyone dared to treat them this way. But he wasn't afraid of the old coots. Their status was no higher than his given the circumstances. One of them was about to speak, but Deimos beat him to it. How the hell have you managed to miss something like this happening right under your noses? Somebody comes up with a 1-in-a-million-years recipe, pumping out some miracle elixir next door from you, and you're the last people to find out. Deimos's voice shot up again, crushing against the warded walls like a tidal wave, the power of his blessing nearly shattering the soundproofing runes. But the elders didn't seem rattled by his outburst. Unlike his minion earlier, they merely unleashed a sliver of their own presence, shielding their bodies from the annoyance. Next, the oldest of them, a short man with black hair that had begun to gray around his temples, spoke. Deimos, have you ever considered that people might be more willing to give you what you want if you ask them nicely? Listening to the old man's patronizing tone, Deimos felt his rage bubbling up again, but he pressed it down. The only thing that mattered here was finding those elixirs, and snapping at these fossils wouldn't help. As I see it, you have exactly two options in front of you, he said. Either you find out how this happened, or you figure out the recipe yourselves. And you better do it fast, or my father might come here personally and ask us all nicely. This time, all 5 of the elders, their leader included, shuddered at the god's mention, their expressions turning grim. The two sides discussed for another 10 minutes, before the alchemists assured Deimos they would continue to do everything in their power to get to the bottom of this. Then, he handed them one of the vials that Talos guy had sent, asking them to work on the recipe. Of course, everyone involved knew that figuring the base ingredients out from the finished product was a tall order. That said, it was something they had to try in case they failed to locate its maker. Once he was done, Deimos returned to his place, finding the blonde kid waiting outside. His features eased slightly, as he knew the boy was the most capable of his subordinates. Hopefully he'd done a better job than the other morons. Since we couldn't find anything about the elixirs directly, I looked into other strange happenings over the past few days. Jason cut to the chase. And a popular gambling den closed a few hours after we arrived. It didn't open the following day, and nobody has seen the owner since. Deimos gave the boy a questioning gaze, not knowing what a random gambling den had to do with any of this. Still, he knew Jason wouldn't have approached him with this if he didn't have something more. The owner was a girl from the Veritas house. She's only been in the guild for a few years, but she's made quite some money in that time. Veritas? The name did ring a bell, but Deimos was having trouble placing his finger on it. Jason shrugged. I didn't know them either, so I asked around. Apparently, they were affiliated with the Asclepius until they got the shaft right around when the girl joined. She has a truth-seeker bloodline. Deimos's eyes narrowed at the revelation. Indeed, a girl with a good business sense, the ability to detect lies, and a possible connection to the oblivious agents just vanishing out of the blue was a bit conspicuous. Of course, people in the guild died all the time while hunting. It wasn't exactly the safest job. But something told him the girl didn't spend her days on the giant mushrooms. And nobody could have left the settlement the normal way either due to the lockdown they'd imposed. I trust you've already followed through? The boy nodded, before snapping his fingers. Another man in a green robe approached them at the sound of that. Tell him what you told me, Jason commanded, prompting the guy to swallow a lump of saliva. Why yes, I was on guard duty at the gate leading to the hunting grounds on the day of the message. I remember her going out that night, but I never saw her return. Deimos raised an eyebrow. Are you bullshitting us? Or do you memorize the faces of everyone who goes through? Startled, the man took a step back at the outburst. And no, sir. I remembered her because I'm one of her regulars. It made an impression because I've never seen her go hunting bee before. He stuttered, his words an affront to the ears. If he's telling the truth, the girl must be hiding on the spire. Scan every level with the others. Get one of the elders to help you search the top level, he said, before scratching his head. Not that she would have survived surrounded by blue beasts, but look there too just in case. I want to know what happened to her, and I want to know it yesterday. Jason nodded before taking off. The girl must only be a piece of the puzzle, Deimos reasoned, rubbing his chin. Based on what they'd learned, there was indeed a high likelihood she was involved with the distribution of the product. But she wasn't an alchemist. She couldn't have been that as well. So, whoever came up with the recipe was somebody else entirely. Probably one of the veterans in the guild. Maybe even one of those 5 coots themselves. Chances were they got rid of the girl too, disposing of her body to hide their tracks. But Deimos shrugged. Oh well, it doesn't really matter. Now that we've got an actual lead, Jason will sniff them out with his little trick. Chapter 114 Ripples. Grandpa! Why are they taking you? Floria cried as the members of the Divine Root placed Braun in handcuffs, escorting him out of the building. The man could free himself, of course, if he wanted, but he didn't seem to have any intention of resisting. The girl just couldn't understand how things had come to this. Hadn't her grandpa been the one who came forward with the information the gods wanted? Why was he getting punished? Panicking, she rushed behind them, ready to fight against the powerful mages if she had to. Blessings be damned. Of course, she wasn't stupid. She knew she'd probably get killed too. But how could she just watch them take her grandpa away? A firm hand descended on her shoulder, however, locking her in place. Floria instinctively tried to lash out, but withdrew her mana upon noticing who it was. Dad, are we going to let them take him? It isn't fair. They should be treating him like a hero. But Foon shook his head. This all happened because we went behind the orders back to buy those elixirs. For me, we're lucky the Divine Root agreed to our terms. They're going to place our house under their protection for the next 200 years. And they'll even spare me, letting me reach Violet and replace Father. That way we'll have a chance to recover. This is what we wanted, what we traded the information for. But then why? The girl shouted, her voice cracking. They can't just let us go entirely unpunished. It would send the wrong message, her father patiently explained. Listening to him, Floria couldn't help but shudder. She hadn't realized how close her dad had come to being arrested too. Turning back to her grandpa, she noticed he'd been escorted quite far already. She frantically wiped her tears away, trying to look at Braun one last time, just so she could remember him. Yet her vision kept blurring. Floria, your grandpa knew this would happen when he sent that letter. He is a hero, to our family at least. Remember that. The girl nodded, her gaze still glued to the group in the distance. Lord Asclepius, care to explain this situation? An authoritative voice asked. The passive presence it radiated, leaving all the others in the room with their heads bowed. Nobody dared lift their eyes. Not the dozens of blues, nor even the handful of violets. None but Lord Asclepius himself, a fellow white. Theseus, we've known each other for thousands of years already. I thought we were on first-name basis by now. I'm here on official business, Machaon. I do need to maintain appearances, lest I wrongly give the impression that I'm going easy on you. Theseus clicked his tongue, before scanning the others in the room, each shuddering as his eyes brushed over them. It doesn't matter whether you go easy on me or not, old friend. The answer will be the same. You know how our agents operate. Better than most, in fact. I hope you haven't conveniently forgotten how often the Divine Root employs our services. Machaon replied sharply. Be that as it may, I'm sure you understand how much pressure I'm under to get to the bottom of this. Theseus said. There's nothing we can do to help you. Just like our field agents, the people who registered the mission have also erased all details from their minds. Nobody can recall anything about the one who hired us. How the hell did it even come to this? Theseus snapped. Your agent should have never agreed to transport those elixirs. They should have rejected the mission and reported it right away. But Machaon shook his head. How was anybody supposed to know those were elixirs, let alone ones as revolutionary as this? Lacking any other information, our agent must have assumed they were just a new variety of potions or something. Or did you want them to taste them too? Theseus didn't respond right away, considering his words. Next, he looked McCann in the eyes before speaking. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether your house is in the right or not. You know that, right? McCann clenched his fists as he unleashed his own presence, pushing back Theseus's as the two domains collided, prompting the others to retreat a few steps just in case. The clash went on for several minutes, as neither of the powerful whites was willing to back down. At least not at first. This is as stupid as it is pointless. McCann eventually waved in exasperation, withdrawing his aura. Just tell me what you want from me. A scapegoat. Theseus cut to the chase before elaborating. We both know there's no way to identify who employed you, but a head is going to roll today all the same. If you can't find the specific agent who took the mission, pick a different one. I don't care who. McCann's eyes widened at the sheer audacity of the request. It wasn't until a moment later the words sank deep enough for him to grit his teeth. Must we resort to such a barbaric outcome? McCann, I'm not playing games here, Theseus said, his tone not leaving room for debate. Either you sacrifice one of your agents, or it's the two of us who'll lose our heads. This is amazing, Uncle Gareth exclaimed. If we get those elixirs, even I could reach Violet. Aren't you a little too excited for something that would still be over 1,000 years away? Dad shut him down, though it didn't last long. Still, I'll reach Blue much faster too. Gareth spoke again after a few moments, his enthusiasm clearly not so easy to douse down. Silence, Uncle Galahad said. If and when the Divine Order decides to mass-produce this Aurora Dew, we will give priority to the Yellowborns. Whether anyone else gets any will depend on the cost and availability. Hearing them discuss the topic of the elixirs, Elaine gave her grandpa an odd look, as he also tossed a fleeting glance her way. It hadn't been long since they allowed her to attend these strategy meetings. Yellowborns were given the privilege younger, as they represented the future leaders of the family. Though she didn't say anything, today she was only here to listen. Archibald cleared his throat. Just a reminder that we're here to discuss House Tantalus, not the fancy new elixirs, he said, putting the debate to rest. Hearing him, Uncle Balin slammed his fist, shaking the long table. He must have held back too, or it would have shattered to splinters. What's there to discuss? I say we attack them head-on already. Are we afraid of those bastards? The others averted their gazes following his outburst, Elaine included. Everyone still stepped on eggshells around him, knowing the man was grieving. It hadn't even been a year since Hector's death. Calm down, son, Grandpa said. We'd probably win an all-out war, but our losses would be greater that way. Though I agree we need to escalate our attacks too, if we want them to stop. It had already been months since their house started fighting back, having killed many of House Tantalus's members in that time. Still, that only seemed to pour oil in the fire, as their enemies retaliated even more aggressively. They appeared determined to weaken them regardless of the cost, their goal probably being to prevent Galahad from consuming a petal. After all, they already had their hands full against Archibald, a Violet core with a powerful bloodline. They clearly didn't want to deal with a second one in possession of a composite affinity. I bet they'll escalate even more after that announcement. Elaine smiled bitterly. The meeting continued for a few hours, as everyone exchanged ideas and plans on how to best defend the western side of the Camelot province from their enemies. River Glane had always served as a natural barrier, splitting the province in two down the middle, but the recent unrest had made the rival house a lot more daring. It wasn't until the meeting was over that Elaine approached Archibald. She waited until they were alone in the room before speaking. Grandpa, those elixirs, do you think? She trailed off, though the man clearly caught her meaning. Hard to say. The fact he managed to become a full-fledged alchemist in a few years is impressive. But coming up with a new recipe so quickly? That sounds a little far-fetched. Elaine nodded in agreement, though Archibald wasn't done. Still, it's quite the coincidence this happened so soon after he arrived there. The old elixirs had remained mostly unchanged for tens of thousands of years. I suppose it's not impossible he was involved. Given his ability, she gasped. Do you think he might be in trouble? How should I know? We aren't even sure it's him. If it is, it was smart of him to not tell us through the letters. These things are better shared in person. Let's just hope he knows what he's doing. Similar scenes played out all across Remir, as those involved with the new elixirs tried to hide, and everyone else couldn't wait to get their hands on the miraculous product. Percy would have been shocked had he seen how far his actions had reached. In fact, the ripples extended all the way to a dark room hidden in some remote location, where no sound was ever heard, nor any soul did ever visit. It was a simple room, lacking any furniture. There was only a mat, with 2 incense burners lit up on either side. The faintly sweet scent of agarwood permeated the place, as a hooded figure meditated silently atop the mat. Had somebody stumbled upon the room, they might have thought the person was a corpse, and not a very important one at that. After all, they were dressed in naught but the cheapest clothes, a ragged outfit of worn linen. It was as if somebody had picked the lowest commoner off the street and left them here to starve for whatever reason. Yet, here, in this room in the middle of nowhere, amidst the thick veil of darkness and hidden beneath the unassuming hood, a pair of lips curled upward. Chapter 115, Close. Percy, what is it? The young man asked, sensing the crow's urgency through their bond. Getting used to hearing actual words from Mickey would take a while. People. He sighed. They were bound to run into somebody sooner or later. It was the downside of traveling along a paved road, especially one leading to a destination as popular as the Alchemists' Guild. If anything, it was more surprising it had taken 3 days for this to happen. Hermes' message must have spooked everyone. Percy guessed most merchants would steer clear of the spire for the next couple of weeks, waiting for the dust to settle. Yet some people didn't care, apparently. How many? 3. On horses. Yes. The young man nodded, assuming they had at least one person below yellow with them. Ideally, it would be nice to know their exact grades to decide the best course of action, though that might be asking for too much. Mickey couldn't get too close to them, or they might notice something was off. That's why Percy had asked his familiar to fly wide circles around him and Nesha, scouting the area while remaining at least a mile away. That way, he might pass for a wild bird that just happened to roam the region. Back when they'd first headed to the spire, things hadn't been as bad. Orange beasts weren't nearly as rare, nor as dangerous, so one flying above somebody wouldn't raise an eyebrow. Now that Mickey had evolved, however, he was more than a little conspicuous. Not to mention, it would be easier to spot the crow's bandage from up close. Naturally, Percy had wrapped it around his familiar's abdomen again after escaping the hive, though it looped fewer times now. Nesha. There's a group behind us. Let's find some cover just in case. Honestly, Percy was confident they could handle them. He doubted they were too strong and, if they were unlikely to be bandits. Nobles and Yellowborns didn't need to dabble in petty crime. That said, he'd prefer to avoid them altogether, whoever they were, for multiple reasons. First, he was still half naked, his body covered in dirt and grime. It made the prospect of meeting people a little embarrassing. Second, he'd rather not be seen anywhere close to the spire. Making up their minds, he and Nesha upped the pace, to keep their distance from their unwitting pursuers. They scanned the surrounding scenery for a good place to hide. Most of it was flat, entire fields of yellow grass stretching to the horizon, though it wasn't tall enough to shroud them properly. Finding something they could work with took about an hour. Straying from the path once more, they made their way to the first hill they spotted, hoping to wait there for the group to pass. Alas, despite their caution, or perhaps because of it, they were caught off guard by what happened next. Well, what has the wind delivered today? A creepy voice asked. It sounded quite off, as if the man behind it was wheezing. In front of Percy stood a trio in mismatched leather outfits, all of them sporting scraggly beards, grinning with yellowed teeth. The one who'd spoken appeared to be their leader, standing in the middle of the bunch. He had a nasty scar marring the upper half of his neck and up his chin, all the way to his bottom lip. Right where it ended, the man's canine was missing. How? Nesha began to ask, though she trailed off as she put two and two together. This was the only place in the surrounding area where one could take cover, so didn't that work both ways? Evidently, it also made for a great ambush spot. In fact, if Percy's guess was right, the other three were probably on their way here, the two groups being in cahoots. Ha ha ha. I'll tell you what. Hand over that enchanted bandage and the girl, and we'll let you go. We don't get off killing punks. Yeah, right. Fat chance they were willing to leave a survivor behind. Especially once they found out about the spatial amulet hidden beneath his bandage. But Percy wasn't paying attention to the bandits' offer. 2 yellows and 1 orange. It wasn't that intimidating a lineup. Nesha didn't have much experience fighting, but she shouldn't have much trouble dealing with the weaker guy. As for the other two, Percy felt confident fighting them by himself. Stepping forward, he took a couple breaths in quick succession, building up his reserves. His body was still sore from all that madness in the hive, but otherwise uninjured. Brat, are you deaf? Toss me your bandage, or else. The leader spoke. Then, he manifested a fireball the size of a watermelon above his palm, trying to spook him. He must have thought it was working too, judging from the smirk on his face. Though Percy didn't blame him. Seeing him breathe rapidly, they were probably under the impression he was hyperventilating or something. Well, if the idiots thought so, they were in for a rough awakening. Let me make you a counteroffer, Percy replied, the calmness in his tone eliciting a frown from the bandit. Back off now, or it'll be too late once I start. The criminal just stared at him for a few seconds, blinking a couple times. The others also looked at each other, until one of them broke into a cackle, causing the others to follow. Ha 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 ha. Start what? The rightmost guy asked, but Percy remained silent. He already had his answer. Mickey, keep an eye out for the other 3. If they come this way, kill them all. The young man wasn't concerned about his familiar's safety in the slightest. Following his promotion, the crow might even be stronger than he was. As long as the other group didn't have somebody at green, there shouldn't be anything to worry about. Truth be told, this situation felt a little nostalgic. Hadn't they run into bandits on the way to the guild too? Back then, Percy had relied on deception and sneak attacks to survive. Rick's group had been weaker than today's enemies too. Let's see how much I've grown then. The bandit's eyes widened as a series of cyan lines lit up underneath Percy's skin. They were static and orderly, spreading out of his abdomen, reaching every corner of his body. At the same time, a silver maelstrom raged within, carving violent gushes through Percy's soul, drawing a constantly shifting vortex around his sternum. Panicking, the leader tossed the fireball right at him. But Percy had seen the attack coming before the man even launched it. Hooking his arm around Nesha, he leapt backwards, calmly watching the spell blast a patch of grass into ashes where he'd previously stood. Everyone gave him odd looks. The girl had seen his boosting art back when he rushed out of the tunnel, though they hadn't discussed it. Now that it appeared again, she couldn't help but examine him curiously. As for the bandits, they now sported a strange mix between greed and caution they had lacked a moment ago. The young man didn't care about any of them, however. He'd already decided to not keep much from Nesha anymore. They were in this together now. As for his enemies, well, their fate had been sealed the moment he activated circulation. Though he didn't stop there. Inhaling again, he pushed his body further, his muscles tensing as they brimmed with strength, his abs causing his bandage to stretch. Beads of sweat popped up all over his reddened skin, as motes of 2 colors leaked out of his pores, shrouding him in a twin halo of cyan and silver. Nesha, take the rightmost guy on. I'll handle the others. He muttered, though the bandits must have heard him too, as all 3 began to prepare their own spells. The guy in the middle formed a new fireball, as the other 2 both used water. What? By yourself? They're both at yellow. The girl was taken aback. What are you going to do? Percy shrugged. If anything, this was a good opportunity to test something else he'd been working on. Neither the Starry Night nor the horde of wasps had been suitable opponents, but these people were. Next, he focused on his mana, as the two halos around his frame began to change. Cyan and silver blended together into a single aura, as smoky wisps of teal enveloped him. What else? I'm gonna get myself some new clothes. Chapter 116 Mantle. Oversized fireballs and blasts of pressurized water rained upon Percy one after the other, keeping him on his toes. The surrounding patches of grass had all been reduced to soggy cinders, his boots leaving dozens of prints as he danced along the soot and mud, dodging the apocalyptic storm of magic. Had it been a single enemy, he wouldn't have had as much trouble evading. He'd already done something similar years ago in the guild, back when he'd been much weaker. However, the situation that night had been a little different. His opponent had been an earth user, an affinity not exactly famous for its speed. Also, comparing that person to the two bandits, Percy was starting to think he might have been drunk. I suppose that would explain why he went hunting on the first level in the middle of the night. And that wasn't all. Percy's ability to dodge the spells heavily hinged on reading his target's intentions via soul vision. Sadly, he couldn't exactly keep his eyes on two people at the same time. Of course, the situation wasn't that bad. He could easily put some distance from them if he wanted, as he was much faster, and they had no way of catching up. It was approaching them he had trouble with. So, the two sides were essentially at a stalemate, as neither one could land a hit on the other unless they made a mistake. Oh well, Percy grinned. More practice for my affinity fusion. He'd already grown used to combining his two types of mana, but he hadn't had much opportunity to test that in the heat of battle, as neither the Starry Night nor the Horde of Wasps had been suitable opponents. And he did need to knock a few kinks off his new trick. Constantly aligning and maintaining his mana while watching his enemies and dodging their attacks was tough. Yet that was exactly what made this fight so valuable. Sure, he could probably find a way to win without it, but why waste such a willing pair of whetstones? As for the outcome of the battle, he wasn't too concerned. He knew he had the advantage, though the bandits hadn't noticed. Due to his outlandish regeneration, they'd exhaust their cores before he did. Now it was just a question of whether they'd realize it in time, prompting them to take a risk he could pounce on. Either way, they were screwed. I wonder how Nesha is doing. Retreating a few paces to give himself some space, he tossed his companion a quick glance to check whether she was okay. Not the best idea. So shocked was he by what he saw, he nearly caught a fireball to his face. Yet even that wasn't enough for him to pick his jaw off the ground. What the hell? The girl and the final bandit had put some distance from them, and were just standing around doing nothing. Forget about fighting. The morons didn't even bother to look at one another. Their attention glued to his own battle. Mind lending a hand since you're free? He didn't really need help, but it irked him to see her chilling while he did all the work. If I do, he'll butt in. She pointed at the bandit with her elbow. And the guy actually nodded at that. It was ridiculous, but it made sense. Kinda. Neither of them felt confident joining the bigger fight, so their fate would inevitably be decided by the victor. Not how I would have done things if I were in her shoes, but I suppose that's why she never got into fighting in the first place. Percy shook his head, focusing back on his own enemies. The two were nearly out of breath already. They threw each other a quick glance, seemingly communicating something, before drawing most of their remaining mana out of their cores. Here it is. Their gamble. Readying his stance, Percy tensed his calves and scanned the two souls carefully, as he began to gather the teal wisps into his hand. He was going to meet the all-out offensive of two yellow cores with his own. 6 condensed balls of azure shot at him in quick succession, trying to block out all his escape routes. Each punched a foot-deep crater into the ground before exploding in a splash of water. None of them hit, but, together, they forced Percy into an awkward stance, right as the 7th projectile flew towards him. A spinning blast of fire twice as large and 3 times as fast as the others. Percy's eyes widened at the sight of the rapidly expanding flame, but he didn't panic. With a swing of his arm, he coalesced all the fused mana he'd gathered since the start of the battle, forming a large teal sheet, 3 meters long and half as wide. Then, the fluttering cloth slammed onto the incoming projectile like a whip, forcing it to explode before reaching its intended target. The shockwave shot Percy butt first into the mud, as the heat scorched a layer of skin off his front side. Luckily, he'd thought to shield his eyes with his elbow in time. "Percy!" a female voice yelled, as a cloud of steam enveloped him. "Is he dead?" The bandit leader also asked, more relieved than disappointed. Evidently, he'd grown more concerned with keeping his life than covetous over Percy's secrets by now. Sadly for him, however, he wasn't walking away with either today. "I'm fine," the young man replied, pushing himself up. In their corporeal state, his teal constructs were no stronger than pure mana, which meant they couldn't survive a frontal collision against an elemental spell a full grade higher. However, Percy could still use them to collapse an incoming spell early, lessening the damage he took greatly. And that was just the start. As the steam faded, the bandit's eyebrows shot up upon seeing the young man standing, a cyclone of tattered strips of teal cloth spinning around him while inching closer to his hand. There, they latched onto one another, quickly restoring Percy's latest tool back to its original shape. Within mere seconds, it was complete again, though a little smaller than before. "My turn," he said with a toothy grin. Next, he dashed towards the leader, swinging the teal sheet again as soon as he reached the halfway point. The spell shifted mid-movement, the cloth now replaced by a couple dozen throwing stars, their curved blades making shrill sounds as they spun through the air toward their target. "Damn!" the bandit shouted as he tried to shield himself with whatever dregs of mana he could still summon. Which wasn't much. He'd exhausted most of it in that last attack. A pathetic spark lit up in each of his hands, but the man didn't give up, slamming them against one another. Apparently, he wanted to imitate Percy's trick, using the small explosion to block the projectiles. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't meant to be. So caught up was he in this last-ditch effort to protect himself, he didn't notice the blades had gone silent at some point. Through soul vision, Percy watched the projectiles phase through the shockwave unaffected, before stabbing countless holes into the bandit's soul. The man dropped limp in the mud a second later. By the time he turned to the other one, the poor guy was running for his life. Gritting his teeth, Percy gave chase. Whatever happened, he couldn't let a witness go after revealing all his secrets. Catching up wasn't easy, however. It should have been, but Percy suspected his opponent was using some minor bloodline to boost his physical speed. The two men ran, one hot on the other's tail, as they both tried to recover some mana amidst their dash. "Mickey, how are things on your end?" "3, dead." The familiar sent him an image of the corpses. All of them were covered in nasty gashes from head to toe, lying in bloody pools. Only one showed a yellow core within Mickey's mana sense, the very same he was currently feasting on. "Just finish what you're doing and go kill the last one. We can't let him escape," Percy said. For some reason, he had this sneaking suspicion Nesha wouldn't bother chasing him. Turning back to his own target, he tossed a handful of teal daggers at him. But the bandit had learned his lesson. He didn't try blocking, instead summoning a splash of water beneath his feet, sliding away from the projectiles. Clicking his tongue, Percy formed the teal sheet again. He continued his pursuit, drawing and pouring mana until it was back to its full size, before swiping his arm again. Once more, the man used what little water mana he'd managed to recover, evading the barrage by the skin of his yellowed teeth. Sadly for him, however, Percy's spell could do more than just turn incorporeal. In his rush to dodge, the bandit had made a terrible mistake. Relying solely on his eyes, he had completely failed to notice a second bunch of daggers, these only visible through mana sense. And just like that, he joined his former boss in the afterlife. "Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Mantle of Deceit. Refined." Nesha watched Percy as he picked clothes from the dead bandits, testing them until he found some his size. Whenever he was done with a corpse, he'd toss it to his crow to feast on. Suffice to say, the sight was more than a little disturbing, but that wasn't what she was concerned about. She'd known her partner had harbored his fair share of secrets for a while now, but the things she'd seen over the last few days had vastly exceeded her wildest imaginations. From the powerful beasts he seemed to effortlessly command, to the bizarre techniques he had unleashed on the bandits, Each layer he revealed was more shocking than the last. In fact, she was pretty sure by now that he and his pet had 2 cores each. Somehow. Hell, she'd just watched the duo dismantle an entire band of bandits by themselves. Was Percy really just a Redborn? He wasn't this strong when we joined the guild. Nesha was sure of it. She'd seen him return from his hunts worn out, with barely a couple vials full of nectar. Has he come this far in the last 3 years? But then, the revolutionary Aurora dew that had turned Remier upside down. Compared to this, it was nothing. Just the tip of the iceberg. A mere afterthought. The realization sent a chill down Nesha's spine. Unbeknownst to everyone, biding its time away from politics and wars, hidden beneath the shadow of the fungal spire, in some corner where nobody ever bothered to look, a monster had been born. End of Book 1. Whispers of the Ghost Alchemist. Chapter 117 Destination. I look like a bandit, Percy groaned, glancing down at his mismatched outfit. You stink like one too, Nesha said, pinching her nose as she inched further away from him. Hey, remind me again, who was it that took all my spare clothes? Percy asked in a faux offended tone. But the girl just shrugged unapologetically. Woo-hoo, I'm dressed as a commoner, she said flatly. What an upgrade. Percy shook his head, not seeing any point in continuing the argument, though he did pick up the pace, eager to find some water to wash up. If his memory served him, they should be reaching River Glane in the next few hours. They could look for a good spot to camp there. Found anything edible? He asked his familiar. Rat, the crow replied. The young man frowned at the prospect of eating rodent meat for the 2nd day in a row. Sadly, there was only so much space in his amulet, so they had to ration their supplies for a rainy day. Still, I swear he's doing it on purpose. He's always had a taste for the darn things. He sighed. The duo walked in silence until nightfall, only stopping once the body of water came into view. Next, they spent a while longer traveling along the river, looking for a decent camping spot. It wasn't easy as their surroundings were still mostly flatlands, but they did eventually stumble upon a semi-concealed place between a few large boulders. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. After drinking his fill, Percy scrubbed his clothes a few times until he was somewhat satisfied. Of course, he knew no amount of washing would ever completely rid him of the stench, but he hoped it wouldn't be quite as nauseating over the remainder of their journey. Once he was done, he set his alchemy tools up. Unfortunately, he had yet to condense tomorrow's crystals and brew the corresponding elixirs. It was annoying he had to spend 5 hours every night doing this, but it couldn't be helped. He'd only waste his previous efforts if he started skipping days. I suppose I'll be able to cut the time down some more if I keep practicing. After confirming with Mickey that the coast was clear, Percy activated synchronization. Next, he formed a blob of cyan between his palms before beginning the first of his daily chores. Surprisingly, Nesha didn't slack off either while he worked. She lit a campfire, taking it upon herself to cook their dinner. Apparently, the crow had found a snake too, so their meal was quickly turning into a veritable buffet. As soon as Percy was done, he drank his 3rd set of Aurora Dew for the day, using his whirlpool technique to cleanse both cores. Having mastered it some time ago, he could get the full benefit from the elixirs now. Mickey and Nesha joined him too, consuming a dose each. Only after they were done did the humans finally pick their kebabs up, taking a bite. As for the crow, well, he preferred his food raw. It tastes nice, Percy exclaimed. The girl didn't reply, though he didn't miss her lips curving slightly at the compliment. Evidently, she wasn't that bad a cook. Still, knowing where the food had come from did dull his appetite somewhat, so he didn't eat much in the end. So, are you going to tell me where we're going? Nesha suddenly asked, breaking him out of his thoughts. Home, Percy replied. Then he scratched his head. Well, kinda, he added vaguely. By now, the group had almost entered the Camelot province where his family was based. However, the young man wasn't planning to return to the Avalon House's mansion directly. While his home was probably the safest place to brew elixirs and send out his clones, He knew getting there wouldn't be easy. After all, House Tantalus's goons constantly patrolled the borders, looking for opportunities to hurt his family. That said, Percy still wanted to be close to his house, so that he could reach them more easily when the lotus bloomed. As a result, he figured it was best to settle somewhere within the province. And he'd picked the exact spot too. "We're going to Bogside Town." Nesha raised an eyebrow, prompting him to explain. "Returning to my family is currently not an option, so staying in a small town nearby is the next best place for the time being. We'll just have to keep our heads low for a while." "Why that one specifically, though? I'm sure the Camelot province has multiple." Percy nodded. Indeed, the western side had 3 of them, but Bogside Town wasn't among them. Instead, it was on the eastern side, being one of the 2 under their enemy's control. "The members of House Tantalus are currently roaming my family's territories like sharks, eager to take a bite. But I doubt they'd look twice at a couple of commoners passing through their own side of the province. We'll enter from the north and make our way to the town. We'll hide there, right under their noses, looking for an opportunity to reach my house in the next 2 years." Nesha creased her brow at the explanation. She didn't seem convinced. "If the only issue is the blockade, there are other ways around it. We could circle the province and enter your family's side from a different spot." "Indeed, we could," Percy said, before grinning. "But I have another goal in Bogside Town." "Which is?" "Remember how I said we only have enough elixirs to last us 2 years? Yes?" The girl tilted her head in confusion, apparently unsure what this had to do with anything. "Well, we can't return to the guild anytime soon, so there's only one other place where we could possibly restock on elixirs." Nesha's eyes widened as she realized what he intended to do. Indeed, after the Alchemist's Guild, the next best place to find a large amount of elixirs was a noble house's warehouse. After all, a family of that size had over 500 members, of which around 200 would receive elixirs regularly. Assuming they had enough in stock to last them a couple of years, which was the norm for his family at least. It meant their combined stash would last Percy and Nesha for over a decade. And if he was going to raid a noble house's storage, what better target than his family's enemies, the very ones who murdered his parents? "Have you lost your mind? How are we going to accomplish something like that?" Percy shrugged. "Well, I admit that's the part one haven't figured out yet," he said with a sheepish grin plastered all over his face. "Still, we have 2 years to find a way." "You're nuts." The girl shook her head but didn't say anything else. There was actually one more reason why Percy had picked that particular town over the other. Now that Mickey had advanced, they needed a good place for him to stay. A place where he'd have access to all the higher-grade food he now needed. And as it so happened, Bogside Town was located right next to a dangerous swamp filled with orange and yellow beasts, the Grizzly Bog. Putting out the fire, Percy cleaned the camp up a little before finding a decent spot to sleep. Then he reached out to his companions. "Nesha, Mickey, can you 2 do me a favor and split tonight's shifts between yourselves? I'll make it up to you later." The 2 groaned at the prospect of staying up longer, but ultimately agreed. Naturally, Percy had a reason for voicing this request, and it wasn't because of laziness. He needed to get a good rest, as he had something important to do the following day. Their target was still a week away, but that wasn't the only place Percy would be visiting in the near future. While it hadn't been that long since his latest wasp clone got destroyed, the colossal amount of soul mana his familiar had harvested from the Starry Night had been more than enough to fully heal his soul. Now that his ventures inside the hive had been placed on hold, it was finally time for the young man to resume sending clones out of Remir. Let's hope it's a lucky one. Chapter 118, Takeo. "Takeo, don't leave the village. It's too dangerous," Father said sternly. But he wasn't having it. "This is exactly why we have to go. We can't just wait here like cowards." Sengo reached for his son, but the boy shook the hand off his shoulder. Grabbing his father's latest creation from a table, he bolted out of the room. "Come back," Sengo yelled, though his voice only grew more distant as the boy ran through the empty streets, his wooden sandals clacking against the paved dirt. Takeo circled around the house by the corner of the road before heading straight, right into the dense thicket. The pale moonlight was already faint to begin with, though it vanished entirely as the young man dove into the black vines. The infernal things blotted out the sky, greedily shrouding the world in their demonic embrace. At least the young man's eyesight had always been the sharpest in the village, so he could still see where he was going. Somewhat. He strapped the object he had taken from his father to his waist, before unsheathing his own machete from the other side. He ducked and squeezed through the vines whenever he could, his smaller frame making things easier, though he still had to hack an opening once in a while. Every few steps, the boy caught one of the thorn-covered tendrils shift by the corner of his eye. Had this been a few years ago, he might have chalked it up to fear, but he knew the time of the feast was almost upon them. No way I'm letting everyone get eaten. The young man roamed the jungle for hours, though he never extended too far from the village. If he was going to kill somebody, he figured he might as well look for a raider targeting his people. Plus, he had the advantage in his own turf. Knowing the place like the back of his hand, it would be harder to fall into an ambush here. Eventually, he stopped upon spotting a few broken vines. Somebody must have passed through recently. In the last few minutes too, otherwise the jungle would have repaired the damage already. Putting his machete away, Takeo grabbed the hilt of the other object, clenching it tightly in his grasp. Twisting the blade upwards, he pulled it slightly from its sheath. Then he crouched, advancing through the thicket with more caution. At the same time, he scanned his surroundings for more signs of activity. And it wasn't long before he found another broken vine, and then a third. Soon, Takeo was hot on his prey's trail, inching closer by the second. The fools won't know what hit them. Aware he was probably close enough they could hear him, he held his breath before brushing a vine aside and peering through a gap in the undergrowth. One of the thorns stabbed into his palm, causing him to wince, but he didn't utter a sound as his gaze finally locked onto his prey. 3 of them. Examining his targets, he firmed his stance, ready to pounce on them, though he hesitated at the last second. One of them was a kid, a boy even younger than he was. Of the adults, only the man was holding a hatchet in his hand. The woman was unarmed. A family! Takeo felt his heart clench at the sight, having second thoughts about doing this. These people weren't raiders. They were probably just running away from all the chaos, looking for a safe place to hide before the feast. Chances were, their home had been destroyed already. It doesn't matter. It's either them or us. Lots of innocents will die anyway. If we can't stop the jungle from awakening. The young man clawed into his arm with his free hand, his fingernails digging into his skin as he tried harnessing the pain to move. But his legs refused to listen. No matter how hard he forced himself, he just couldn't find it in his heart to murder the trio. Suddenly, a vine broke under the pressure, causing the family to jerk their heads in his direction. The kid almost screamed, though his mother covered his mouth. At the same time, the man's features twisted in fury at the sight of Takeo's sword. The latter stepped back, looking for the words to explain himself. But he couldn't find any. After all, he was still considering the act a moment ago. "Leave my family alone, you bastard," the older man hissed, dashing towards Takeo with his hatchet ready. Realizing they were long past words, the young man calmed himself down as he resumed his stance. His enemy was larger and probably stronger, but no fighter. His movements were crude, his steps uneven. Another wave of hesitation bubbled up, but Takeo pressed it down as he drew his sword, its edge the only source of light in the dark jungle, as it reflected whatever scant rays reached it. Thud, thud. The mother covered her child's eyes to shield him from the horror as their world came crashing down. Takeo exhaled the turbid air in his lungs before looking at the two in shame. He knew he should finish the job, but he also understood he didn't have the stomach for it. His arm fell weakly by his side as he dropped his weapon. Of course, he didn't expect the woman to thank him for sparing them. Naturally, she glared at him with unconcealed hatred, occasionally tossing a glance at her husband's decapitated body, the color draining from her face at the gruesome sight. But in the end, she knew what had to be done. Grabbing her son, she ignored his sobs as she suppressed her own, running away before Takeo changed his mind. The young man looked at the corpse one more time. Blood still gushed out of the wound like a fountain, but there wasn't any beneath the body. The jungle had already sucked the pool dry. Takeo picked his sword up before heading off, in search of another group. As disgusted as he was by his actions, the vines wouldn't be satiated with a single meal, or 1,000 for that matter. Others would have to help too if they wanted to delay the feast. Over the next few hours, he continued roaming his village's vicinity, not stopping until he cleared the whole area twice. In that time he found a dozen more targets, though luckily, none of them were civilians. Heavily armed and in groups of at least 3, they posed a much higher threat to Takeo than his first unfortunate victim. Still, between his father's masterfully crafted katana and the sharp combat skills he had honed his whole life, none of the skirmishes gave him much trouble. But it's nowhere near enough. He smiled bitterly. The lives he had sacrificed today weighed heavily on his conscience. But for the vines? They didn't amount to much. Maybe a few hours of peace if they got lucky. Takeo knew he'd have to come back tomorrow, and the day after, and even then, he was only delaying the inevitable. In any case, there wasn't much he could do about it right now. Turning back towards his village, he was about to return home, when something lashed at him. By reflex, he swung the sword at it, managing to intercept the vine in time. The severed tendril twitched a couple of times by his feet before dying down. That one almost got him. Takeo didn't even get the chance to complete that thought when he felt an impact on the back of his head, a sickening crunch reverberating through his skull. His vision blurred as he fell to the ground. At the same time, another tendril wrapped itself around his neck, squeezing it. Can't breathe. The young man tried to chop away at the vine, when he realized he had dropped his sword at some point. Drawing his machete with his left hand, he was about to use that, when another tendril lashed at his wrist, stopping him. Out of options, he resorted to brute strength, though he was no match for the demonic wood. Takeo pummeled the vine again and again, though it didn't do him much good. Each hit was weaker than the one before until he couldn't go on. Finally, the boy's resistance fizzled out into smoke, as his eyes fell shut, the very jungle he had spent all day feeding becoming his undoing. Though this wasn't the end of Takeo's story, as one last chapter had yet to be written, Chapter 119 Infestation. Percy was a little bummed out by his latest venture. This was his first clone outside Remir in months, though luck hadn't been on his side. He'd spent the entire trip looking for a suitable host, but all he'd found were crumbling souls that wouldn't last a minute once he took over. In the end, he went with the least damaged option, though their grade left much to be desired. It was somewhere between a red and an insect, which was a first for him. Better than nothing, I guess. At least the actual possession went smoothly. For some reason, his host appeared completely absent this time. It was nothing like the lizard or the furball, which had remained passive yet still present in the background. No, this body's owner was Gonzo. Encountering zero resistance, Percy slid between the gaps, patching the broken soul with unprecedented ease. A few memories flashed through his mind in the process, though they were too disorganized to piece together. What the hell? Did this guy get hit in the head or something? Tapping into the body's senses, Percy finally pried his eyes open, only to be greeted by endless darkness. After a moment, some vague shapes started coming to focus, but he didn't have the chance to worry about them, as he discovered he couldn't even breathe. Something was squeezing his neck tightly. Trying to move his hands, he soon realized his left was bound too, leaving him only his right to pummel the object with. Whatever it was felt slimy, its surface smooth and damp. It slowly slithered around his throat, a small spike tracing a shallow cut along his skin as it did so. The hell? Some kind of thorny snake. Not getting anywhere barehanded, Percy summoned a sliver of his stored mana, forming a weapon in his hand. Soon, a teal flash sliced a line through the darkness, severing the tendril off him. Percy filled his lungs with air a couple of times as he practically felt the color return to his face. But he was still trapped. Hacking again with his sickle, He cut another 3 snakes a second later, freeing the rest of his limbs. Jumping to his feet, he activated Mana Sense, hoping to scan his surroundings better. Or he tried to, at least. For some reason, his current body couldn't even use Mana Sense. That's a new one. Accepting that his impaired eyesight was all he could rely on, he examined the ground around him, attempting to decipher what had happened to his host. Faintly illuminated by his mana construct, he spotted 5 severed vines, all of them black like tar, covered in spikes of various sizes. The dead ones weren't moving right now, but the living ones were wriggling ominously as they waited for another opportunity to pounce. Making a note to keep an eye on the strangely animated plants, Percy's attention was drawn to a couple of man-made objects glinting nearby. Picking the first one up, he noticed it was a slender sword, sporting a single curved edge. A quick test revealed its sharpness wasn't a joke, as it cut a couple inches into another vine with minimal effort. Wow, is this really a mundane weapon? There sure weren't any runes visible on its surface, nor the typical glow he would expect from a mana-rich alloy. Finding a scabbard matching the sword strapped to his waist, he sheathed it, before picking the second object off the ground. This one was a machete, crafted from the same material, though its edge had dulled a little from overuse. Still, it was better than any steel tool he'd seen on Remir. I suppose I can rely on these for the time being. Allowing his construct to crumble, he collected as many of the teal shreds as he could, storing them back inside his soul. Some strange force was pulling on them, trying to pry them from his control, but Percy would be damned if he let his limited supply get snatched so easily. Exerting all the willpower he could muster, he forcibly dragged most of the substance into his body, ultimately recovering about 3/4 of the amount he'd used. Man, this fused mana is a game-changer. Percy couldn't help but nod in appreciation. The young man had naturally been thrilled upon discovering he could supply his clones with the teal mana as long as it was stored in its ethereal form. Not only did this let him essentially cheat some pure mana into his clones, it was highly recyclable too, allowing him to get a lot more value from it before it ran out. In any case, better get a move on. There was a lot to think about, but this wasn't the time or the place. Looking around, Percy realized he recognized the scenery somewhat. Despite the poor lighting, his host seemed to be extremely familiar with the area. In fact, he could even tell which way home was. Heading towards the village he scarcely remembered, he soon noticed his body was rather weak. Exhausted and injured all over, yes, but that wasn't it. It reminded Percy of his youth, from before he advanced to Orange. Come to think of it, there's no mana in the air whatsoever. No wonder he couldn't even use Mana Sense. Had his host not even awakened his core? Suddenly, a vine lashed at him from his right, though he was prepared for it. With a semi-awkward swing of his machete, he cut it to pieces, though he didn't relax just yet, knowing more could attack at any moment. Ignoring the soreness and pain, he picked up the pace, practically running towards his host's village, hacking at whatever obstacle stood in his path. Is this jungle the reason there isn't any mana here? If the black vines sucked all the ambient mana in this world, it would explain why his host had never managed to awaken his core. For all Percy knew, the poor sap might have been born with a yellow one, but he'd lived and died without ever enjoying its benefits. And as if that wasn't enough, the hateful plants weren't satisfied with all the mana they stole, seemingly thirsting for blood too. In fact, this situation felt a little familiar to Percy, as he couldn't help but recall something he'd read about on Remir. Could this be an infestation? The gods of the divine order weren't that open about their operations, but a few morsels of information did trickle down to the mortals like him. From what he knew, foreign races weren't the only threat the deities had to deal with. Other than the fierce competition over resources and territories, gods across the universe had another major enemy, this one in common: demonic infestations. Supposedly formed from the accumulation of negative thoughts, they sprouted randomly like cancers, dooming whatever unfortunate world spawned them. Infestations came in many shapes and sizes, from imps and gremlins as weak as the weakest mortals, to great devils as powerful as the strongest gods, to mindless entities spanning entire worlds, bringing calamity upon their residents. Evidently, this jungle belonged in the latter category. Percy's confidence in his guess grew as he scanned the living vines around him. This didn't seem like a natural phenomenon. Unlike the brown fog he had encountered before, this disaster was alive, dripping with malice and cruelty, its only mission to drive all life to extinction. It was only once he finally reached the edge of the dense thicket that he exhaled in relief, leaving the demonic jungle behind him as he stepped into the pale moonlight. The small village standing before him looked both alien and familiar, as his host's memories bled into his own. Now what do I do? Part of him was curious about the infestation. He knew it was close to some turning point, and it was his first time experiencing one with any of his clones. Not that there was anything to be gained from it, but he was sure he'd run into more in his future travels, so it wouldn't hurt to get a taste. On the other hand, his current clone might be a good candidate to return to the vault with. Stumbling upon a host that was both sentient and brain-dead was a rare stroke of luck. He had free reign over the body, and he wouldn't even have to feel guilty over dragging someone else into his mess. That said, he didn't know if he'd be able to practice Magiscript without a functioning core. Perhaps he could awaken it inside the vault, but his body wasn't in great shape, so it might not last long enough. Let's figure out the situation here first. At the very least, Percy wanted to learn more about the crafting technique of the locals here. The strength and sharpness of his steel tools almost rivaled that of his pure constructs, which was quite impressive for a pair of manaless weapons. Maybe he could learn to make similar tools back home. But before all that, let's see what I'm dealing with. Summoning his status, Percy read his host's details at last. Undersir. Takeo Muramasa, Percival's clone. Undersir. Chapter 120 Sengo.
Mana cores.
Mana Core 1. Red.
Eu.
Mana Core 2. Seed.
Eu.
Spells. Parting Gift, crude. Quarterstaff, crude. Glove, crude. Crystallization, crude. Mantle of Deceit, refined. Decrees. Phoebe's Decree. Grants access to your status. Morai's Decree, incomplete. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Metatron's Decree. Open a one-way portal to the Vault of Magic at will. Undersir. As it turned out, his status was able to recognize Takeo's grade. It was at red, which wasn't exactly great news. Even if Percy could fill it up inside the vault, it wouldn't help him much. No new decree either, though that's to be expected. I doubt any gods can emerge in this place. There wasn't really anything of note here. The only silver lining was that his stash of teal mana allowed him to use most of his spells. He still couldn't use circulation without his cores, but everything else was on the table, at least until his reserves ran out. If everyone else was incapable of using magic, it would give him a significant advantage over the locals. Of course, he wasn't sure he'd even need it. Shrugging, Percy walked along the paved dirt, tracing the way to his host's house by instinct. The first thing he noticed as he traveled through the small village was that the buildings looked a little strange. They were made of some pale, uniform material which looked nothing like the stone buildings they had in the Alchemist's Guild, nor the wooden walls in his family's mansion. They seemed surprisingly sturdy too. Despite the lack of any engravings or magical materials, the houses appeared in decent condition. At least, he couldn't spot any signs of age on their simple walls. Evidently, the crafting techniques of the natives extended beyond their steel tools. Though it wasn't that odd, considering they didn't have magic to fall back to. Back on Remier, people used it as a crutch to solve all their problems. Why bother improving the quality of your materials when you could just carve a couple runes on them to compensate for their deficiencies? Let's figure out how all this works and then leave, Percy decided. Luckily, he didn't meet anyone on the deserted streets, saving him some time. Apparently, they were all holed up in their homes, evident by the faint shadows he occasionally saw shifting through the windows. Every now and then, he caught a glimpse of a villager, which might have startled him under different circumstances. Their deep crimson skin and bright yellow eyes made them more than a little intimidating, not to mention their sharp features, or the 4 fangs each had sticking out of their mouth. However, Percy wasn't scared in the slightest, and that wasn't merely because he could defend himself. Seeing these people through Takeo's eyes, he realized he could put a name to each face. They were his family, the very people he had grown up with. And now he's dead, he thought, feeling his heart tighten. He'd sent plenty of clones, but this was his first time meeting the loved ones of his host. Perhaps he should have prepared himself for this eventuality, though the guilt was hard to stomach. What was he supposed to tell them? Pretend that he was Takeo, only to die in front of them a few days later? Or explain how he had taken over the boy's corpse? The fact that Takeo appeared to be in his early teens only made the situation more tragic. Percy stopped right in his tracks, realizing he couldn't in good conscience return to his host's house like this. He knew the boy had a father waiting for him there, and neither of them deserved to be put in that situation. Yet, just as he was contemplating whether to open a portal to the vault right then and there, or leave the body behind and return to Remire, his worst fear came to light. "Takeo!" a rough voice yelled. It was only now the young man saw the person he recognized as his host's father standing some distance away, staring at him intently, his expression a blend of concern and relief. Percy wanted to turn around and leave, but he never got the chance. The older man sprinted towards him, only stopping once he was a few steps away. Sengo, Percy thought his name was, scanned him up and down, shuddering at the sight of his son's gruesome injuries. Tears rolled down Sengo's face, forming 2 pink trickles on his cheeks. It was only now that Percy managed to recall another tidbit of information from the shattered prism that was Takeo's mind. Apparently, all the people in this world cried red tears, but Takeo's clansmen were a little unique in that theirs were a few shades paler. This was the source of the village's name, Torui. Seeing the man remain quiet, Percy wanted to speak first, to explain that he wasn't Takeo. But the words got stuck in his throat. The two just stood there, staring each other in silence for a few minutes, before Sengo pulled Percy into a firm hug, sobbing as he clenched him tightly. "I told you not to go," the man said in a stern tone. At least Percy could understand him, as Takeo's memories breathed meaning to the words. "Look what happened to you." Sengo spoke again, gesturing at his son's wounds, though it was only now that Percy registered some of the blood on him wasn't his own. In fact, it didn't take much effort to recall where it had come from. Perhaps it was because those memories were more recent, or because they'd had a greater impact on his host. Whatever the reason, he vividly remembered killing over a dozen people, including a scared father protecting his wife and kid. Percy frowned, suddenly feeling a little less sympathetic for the boy. The brat had been a cold-blooded murderer, ruining a family just like that. But he shook his head a moment later, remembering the situation that had led Takeo to do that. "I suppose everyone here is just desperate to survive. The vines will awaken sooner unless they keep sacrificing strangers." Probably realizing what Percy was thinking about, Sengo placed a hand on his shoulder, before lifting his chin with the other. He looked him in the eyes as he spoke. "What's done is done," he said sternly. "Sometimes, taking lives and saving them are one and the same." The young man nodded, though his guilt had more to do with his charade than his host's crimes. He knew it was cowardly of him to remain quiet, but he just couldn't find it in his heart to turn Sengo's world upside down. "Let's tell him tomorrow. He can sleep soundly one more night, and I can think of the best way to deliver the news," was what Percy thought, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Following the man to their house, he placed his hand on the pale wall, feeling its rough surface. Digging into his memories, he tried to recall what the material was called. Took a few seconds, but it eventually came through. "Concrete. Do you want to help me repair Miss Kimiko's house tomorrow?" Sengo asked as he saw him tracing his finger on the material. "Feeding the jungle isn't the only way to protect our village, you know. We can build strong houses and arm everyone with weapons to prepare for the feast." Percy nodded. "Maybe I can stay here until the vines attack. I'll help these people defend themselves, and maybe even learn a couple things in the process. In any case, it wouldn't be long until the infestation reached its final stage. If his host's memories could be trusted, they only had days at most. And each feast was more severe than the ones before. The demonic jungle had existed as far as Takeo could remember, having nearly driven the world's inhabitants to extinction already. Perhaps the few remaining villages would be gone too in another decade or so. After all, infestations were mindless and vicious. They didn't care about self-preservation in the slightest. The only thing they knew was destruction, first of their surroundings, and ultimately themselves. I suppose protecting the boys' people should be enough compensation for the free ride,